That night, before 300 guests, a man emerged from the shadows, not to celebrate the wedding, but to stop it. She stood there with the diamond ring about to be placed on her finger and the bruise on her wrist still fresh. He saw it, and all hell began. This is the story of a man trapped in his own home by pain and the only woman who could pull him out of it. Watch to the end, hit like, and comment where you're watching. I want to know how far this story has come. The rain came down hard that night. Not the soft Seattle drizzle that locals made peace with sometime in October and forgot about by March. This was the kind of rain that meant something, cold and relentless, hammering the glass walls of the Campbell estate like it had a grudge. Inside, 300 people pretended not to notice. They laughed too loudly and drank too quickly and kept their eyes on the chandeliers because looking at each other meant risking a real conversation. And nobody in that ballroom wanted one of those tonight. The engagement party for Mara Whitmore and Preston Atkins had been 6 months in the planning. Florists had been flown in from New York. The champagne was French. The guest list read like a who's who of Pacific Northwest money, tech founders, defense contractors, 2 sitting senators, and every third-generation name that still meant something west of the Cascades. Richard Whitmore had made sure of that. He'd spent 40 years building a fortune and 20 minutes deciding to sell his daughter into it, and tonight was supposed to be the night that investment paid off. Mara stood near the center of the room in a dress that cost more than most people's cars. She was beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful, arranged, maintained, deliberately lit, dark hair pinned back, jaw set, eyes doing that thing they did at parties like this, where they were technically pointed at whoever was speaking, but not actually seeing anything. She was 28 years old, and she had already perfected the art of being present without being there. Preston stood beside her with his hand on the small of her back. His grip was too firm. It had been too firm for the better part of 2 years, but the firmness lived in the fingers, and the fingers were always hidden. By table edges, by the fold of a coat, by a carefully positioned body. Tonight his fingers were pressing into the fabric at her spine, and he was smiling at a hedge fund manager named Davis, who was telling a story about a boat. The smile was easy and white and completely untouched by anything resembling a human interior. Mara held her champagne glass and thought about the way pain traveled up the arm. She'd learned that recently. The specifics of it. The bruise on her wrist was covered by a cuff bracelet, platinum, Preston's gift from their trip to Vienna last fall. He'd been so tender giving it to her. That was the thing about Preston Atkins that nobody outside of 3 locked rooms in 2 different cities understood yet. The tenderness was real. It just existed alongside everything else. The speeches were coming soon. The ring was in Preston's jacket pocket. She'd seen the outline of the box when he'd pulled out his phone earlier. 3 carats, emerald cut, her mother's setting replicated by a jeweler in Pioneer Square. Richard Whitmore had approved the design. Of course he had. He'd approved everything. She was thinking about how to get through the next 40 minutes. The speech, the ring, the applause, the photographs. When the room changed, she felt it before she saw it. A drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the weather. A shift in the air the way a room shifts when someone walks in who shouldn't be there. 300 people didn't go quiet all at once, but they went quiet in a wave starting near the main entrance and rolling inward like something was displacing the sound. Preston's hand went still on her back. Davis stopped his story about the boat mid-sentence and looked toward the east corridor. Mara turned. He was standing at the edge of the light. Nolan Campbell was not a large man in the way that men who rely on size are large. He was 6 feet, lean, with the kind of stillness that certain animals have, the ones at the top of whatever chain they're standing on. His hair had gone silver at the temples. His face was a hard geography of angles that might have been handsome once and had become something else over the years, something less comfortable to look at directly. He was wearing a black suit that hadn't been bought recently, and he was standing with both hands loose at his sides, and every single person in the room was staring at him like he'd walked out of a wall. Because in a way, he had. Nolan Campbell owned the estate they were standing in. His family had built it. His father had entertained presidents here. His wife had been here. 5 years ago, he had apparently decided that the world beyond the Iron Gates could conduct its business without him. And for 5 years, it had. Campbell Defense ran on 30,000 employees and a board of directors who'd stopped expecting Nolan to show up to anything 18 months after the funeral. He sent instructions through lawyers and accountants, and a personal assistant named Diane, who was terrifyingly competent and said very little. He did not attend parties. He did not come outside. He was here. The silence in the room had reached the full 300 guests now, and the only sounds were the rain on the glass and the faint orchestra in the East Wing that hadn't gotten the news yet and was still playing something Viennese and inappropriate. Nolan Campbell looked at Mara Whitmore's wrist. She didn't realize that was what he was looking at. Not at first. She didn't know what she thought. That he was looking at the room, at Preston, at the spectacle of people standing in his house celebrating something he hadn't sanctioned. Then she understood. The bracelet had slipped. Not far. Half an inch. Maybe less. But the light from the chandelier hit at an angle, and the edge of the bruise was visible. That particular shade of yellow-green that meant it was 4 or 5 days old, that it had already moved through its worst colors and was heading toward healed, but hadn't arrived yet. She moved to adjust the bracelet. His voice crossed the room before her fingers could. Lower your hand. 2 words. Not loud. He didn't need loud. The acoustics of the Campbell Estates ballroom were designed for orchestral performances, and his voice carried the way sound carries through the kind of quiet that gets heavy. Every head turned. Preston's fingers went from pressing into her spine to gripping her hip, and the grip was wrong immediately. Too tight. The kind of tight that was a reflex. The kind that said, this is mine and you need to remember that. And Mara breathed through it, because breathing was the thing she'd learned to do first. Mr. Campbell, her father's voice from somewhere to the left. Richard Whitmore, 63 years old, silver-haired, a man who had made a science of being comfortable in rooms that should have made him uncomfortable. We're delighted you could join us. Truly, we didn't expect. I didn't ask for commentary. Richard Whitmore stopped talking. That alone was worth something. Nolan crossed the room. He moved through the crowd the way water moves through a crack, not forcing anything, just finding the space. People stepped aside. They did it without being asked, the way people instinctively make room for something they can't entirely categorize. He stopped 6 feet from Mara. Up close he looked. She couldn't find the word immediately. Worse than she expected. Not in the physical sense. In the sense that his eyes had something behind them that was very old and very tired and still somehow completely alert. He looked like a man running on a kind of fuel that didn't have a clean name. Show me your wrist, he said. She stared at him. I'm not going to ask twice. Preston moved. He came around to Mara's side with the ease of a man who'd practiced occupying space, and his voice had dropped into the register he used when he wanted to sound reasonable to observers. I don't know what you think you're seeing, but this is a private event, and I'd appreciate… Preston. The name came out of Nolan's mouth like a period at the end of a sentence. If you put your hand on her right now, I'll have you removed from a property I own, and every business deal your father has pending with this company will be reviewed before Monday morning. The room was not breathing. Preston smiled. The smile was impressive, actually. It barely flickered. Years of practice. Come on, Nolan. You've been locked in this house for 5 years. Now you want to… Show me your wrist. He wasn't talking to Preston. Mara's heart was beating in a way she didn't fully understand. Not fear, exactly. Or not just that. She looked at her father. Richard Whitmore's expression had arranged itself into something carefully neutral. The face he made when he was calculating rather than feeling, and something about seeing that expression in this moment. This specific moment, with his daughter standing in front of 300 people with a bruise on her arm. Something about it unlocked something in her chest that had been locked for a very long time. She lifted her arm. She slid the bracelet up. The bruise was about 2 inches long, yellow at the edges and still dark purple at the center, wrapping around the inside of the wrist in the shape of a grip. The shape of a specific hand. The shape of a specific night 2 weeks ago in the kitchen of Preston's apartment in Capitol Hill when she'd said she wanted to move the wedding date and he'd said she didn't get to want things like that. The room saw it. The room went. It didn't make a sound, which was somehow louder than if it had. Nolan looked at the bruise for exactly 3 seconds. Then he looked at Preston. Whatever was in his expression in that moment was controlled in a way that suggested the control was the dangerous part, that what was underneath it was worse. Get out of my house, he said. You have no right. Get out of my house, or I'll make a phone call to 3 federal agencies who have had your father's name in a file for 4 years. And have been waiting for someone with standing to ask them to open it. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Preston Atkins stood very still for a moment. Then the smile came back. Thinner this time, stretched over something that was starting to look like fear. And he straightened his cuffs and looked at Mara with an expression that said this conversation is not over in a language she'd become fluent in over 2 years. And then he walked toward the exit. The room parted for him too, but differently. Less reverence. More relief. Richard Whitmore started forward. "Nolan, I think we should—" "Not tonight, Richard." It wasn't a request. Her father stopped. Mara watched him stop and watched the calculation move across his face and watched him decide that tonight was not the night. And for the first time in her adult life, she saw her father back down from something and felt absolutely nothing about it. Nolan turned to her. She was aware that 300 people were still watching. She was aware that her arm was still raised. She lowered it. "Are you hurt anywhere else?" he asked. His voice was different now, still quiet, still precise. But something in the texture of it had changed, like the outer layer of a thing had been set aside. She considered lying. Old habit. She'd gotten very good at the kinds of lies that sound like fine and I'm okay and it's not what it looks like. "No," she said. He looked at her for a moment in a way that suggested he was weighing that answer. "You'll stay here tonight," he said. "I have a place. You'll stay here tonight." It wasn't aggression. It was the same quality of certainty that had stopped Preston's name in its tracks earlier. Not force exactly. Gravity. "Diane will show you to the East Wing. There are clothes in the wardrobe that should fit. Don't go back to wherever you've been staying until I know it's safe." "You don't know me." "I know a bruise." She didn't have an answer for that. The night dissolved into something disorganized after that. Guests filing out in small clusters, some lingering near the exits with their phones already out. The orchestra finally stopping when someone from the staff got to them. Richard Whitmore standing near the bar with a glass of something amber and the posture of a man reassessing. Diane, a small, precise woman in her 50s who moved like someone who had managed catastrophes for decades and found it unremarkable, appeared at Mara's elbow and led her through a corridor she hadn't seen before, away from the chandeliers and the catering staff and the wreckage of an event that had cost $400,000 to stage. The East Wing was quieter, darker, the way old houses are dark in the parts that aren't performing for anyone. The carpet was deep blue, the walls paneled in wood that had been there since before Mara was born. Diane opened a door onto a room that was large and clean and cold and had windows that looked out on the formal garden and the gates. The gates were closed, iron, tall, the kind that looked like they were designed to keep things in as much as out. "Is there anything you need?" Diane asked. Mara looked at the room, at the bed with its clean white linens, at the wardrobe standing slightly open, some previous guests' forgotten clothes visible inside, at the window. "No," she said. Diane nodded and left. Mara sat down on the edge of the bed and looked at her wrist. The bracelet was still pushed up. She slid it back down, then thought about it and slid it up again, left it there. She didn't sleep for a long time. Outside, the rain kept doing what it was doing. Sometime around 2 in the morning, she heard footsteps in the corridor. Not Diane's footsteps. She'd learned the sound of Diane within the first hour, the purposeful click of sensible heels against hardwood. These were heavier, slower. A man's walk. Deliberate, like each step was a decision. They stopped outside her door. She sat very still. After a long moment, they continued down the corridor, and she heard a door open and close somewhere farther in the East Wing. She didn't know why that sound, a door closing, ordinary and unremarkable, made her feel less alone. By the time the city's news site started publishing the story at 6 in the morning, the headline was already formed. Campbell intervenes at Whitmore engagement party. Defense magnate breaks 5-year isolation. By 8, every outlet in the country had a version of it. By noon, the variation had calcified into the one that got the most clicks. Nolan Campbell's Mystery Woman. Who is Mara Whitmore? She read it on her phone in the East Wing bedroom, sitting on the floor with her back against the bed, wearing clothes that weren't hers that fit almost exactly right, drinking coffee that Diane had left on a tray outside the door. Mystery Woman. Her. The coffee was very good. That registered, distantly. She'd expected that a man who hadn't left his house in 5 years might have let certain standards slip, The coffee was evidence that he hadn't. She heard him before she saw him. He knocked. Actually knocked. 3 times, measured, which she hadn't expected from a man who'd spoken to 300 people like he was the only one in the room. "Come in," she said, then realized she was sitting on the floor and had a split second to decide whether to get up. She stayed on the floor. Some part of her was done with performances. He came in and looked at her for a moment and didn't comment on the floor. "The story's out," he said. "I saw. How's the wrist?" "It's fine." Mara. Her name from his mouth was a different sound than it was from anyone else's. She noticed that and didn't know what to do with the noticing, so she set it aside. "It's the same as last night," she said. "Yellow-green, tender when I press it, not broken, probably gone in another week." He moved to the window, looked out at the gates. From behind, he looked like someone who had been standing in front of windows for a very long time. "Your father called this morning," he said, "at 5:15. Said he wanted to discuss the situation privately." "What did you tell him?" "That there was nothing to discuss." She looked at his back, the way the early light hit the silver at his temples. "He's going to be furious." "Yes." "He'll pull the Campbell Defense Partnership talks. He's been negotiating them for... I know what he's been negotiating. That doesn't bother you?" He turned from the window. In the morning light, he looked even more tired than he had the night before, but in a way that was somehow more human, less like armor. "What bothers me," he said, "is a woman at her own engagement party covering a bruise with a bracelet her abuser gave her." She absorbed that. "I'm not your problem," she said. "No," he agreed. "You're not." "Then why?" She didn't say. "The media will assume we're together," he said. "That story is already written. It protects you from Preston in the short term. He won't move against you while the public is watching. Your father will wait to see which way the wind blows before he acts. That gives you time." "Time for what?" "To figure out what you want to do next." She looked down at her coffee cup. "And what do you get out of this?" He was quiet for a moment in a way that felt like the question deserved better than a quick answer. "I get to look at something that isn't these 4 walls for a while," he said. She didn't quite believe that was the whole answer, but she let it stand. She stayed. Not because she had nowhere else to go. She had money, an apartment, a network of people who would have taken her call. She stayed because something about the East Wing bedroom and the excellent coffee and the man who had stopped an engagement party and knocked before entering felt, she couldn't name it. Not safe, exactly. Safety had a different texture than this. This was more like standing next to a thing that had already survived the worst it was going to face, and therefore didn't need to perform any particular way about it. She had been surrounded by performance for so long she'd forgotten there was another option. The days that followed had a strange architecture. Diane moved her to a larger suite on the 2nd floor, quieter, with a view of the garden on one side and the city lights on the other. The wardrobe filled with clothes she didn't ask about and assumed were organized by some efficient arm of Nolan's machine. Her phone rang constantly. Her father, Preston's number she stopped answering, journalists whose contact details she didn't recognize. She turned most of them off. She began to learn the estate. It was a particular kind of place, enormous but not cold, full of things that had been chosen rather than curated, books that had been read and returned to shelves, at angles that suggested haste, artwork that was serious without being oppressive. There were rooms that looked like they hadn't been opened in a long time, and rooms that were clearly alive, and the line between them ran somewhere Mara was still mapping. She saw Nolan at dinner the first 3 nights. Diane served them both in a dining room that was clearly designed for 20 people and sat them at one end of a table long enough to feel the distance. The first dinner was mostly silence broken by precise, functional exchanges. Diane's food, the rain, the basic geography of the house that Mara was still learning. Second dinner, he asked about her work. She told him she had a degree in environmental policy from Stanford that she had never been allowed to use because her father had decided her real function was relational rather than professional. She said it plainly, without bitterness, the way you describe a fact you've processed to its conclusion. He watched her say it with an expression she couldn't read. Third dinner, she asked about the locked room at the end of the East Wing corridor. The air in the dining room changed. "That's not a room I go into," he said. "Okay." It was Evelyn's study. She didn't push. She had learned, faster than most people, out of necessity, when a door was closed and when a door was simply not open yet. Evelyn Campbell. She knew the name the way everyone in Nolan's world knew it, through the news coverage of 5 years ago, the car explosion at the estate gates, the investigation that found nothing definitive, the grief that had apparently folded Nolan into himself so completely that he'd become a ghost in his own house. The wife, the dead woman at the center of everything. On the fourth night, she woke at 3 a.m. to a sound she couldn't place. She lay still for a moment, sorting through it. Not Diane's footsteps, not the rain, which had finally broken 2 days ago. A lower sound, almost like a voice, but not quite, coming from the east wing. She got up. She walked the corridor in the dark, not entirely sure why, moving toward the sound because her body made the decision before her brain could counsel caution. The sound got clearer as she moved. Not a voice. Breathing. The specific quality of breathing that belongs to someone who is awake when they don't want to be, in a place that costs them something to be in. She stopped at the door of Evelyn's study. The sound was coming from inside. She put her hand on the door handle, paused, thought about it, then knocked the same way he had knocked on her door 4 nights ago. 3 times, measured, announcing rather than demanding. Silence. Then, don't. She took her hand off the handle. She stood in the corridor for a moment, in the dark, with the sound of a man's difficult breathing on the other side of a door, and she understood something about Nolan Campbell that the news coverage hadn't touched. Not grief as an event. Grief as a place you kept returning to in the dark hours, alone, whether you wanted to or not. She went back to her room. She didn't sleep. In the morning, at breakfast, he was at the table before she came down. He looked like he always looked. Contained, precise, 1 coffee cup already at his elbow. He didn't reference the night. She didn't reference the night. Diane brought eggs and something from the garden, and the morning paper folded to a story about a senator's infrastructure bill. I need to go back to my apartment, Mara said. I have things there. He looked at her over his coffee cup. Give me a list, he said. I'll have someone get them. I need to go myself. Why? Because it's still mine. She said it quietly. No sharpness, just the word itself. There are things in that apartment that are mine, and I need to be the one who gets them. He set down the coffee cup. Preston knows that address. I know he knows it. Then you understand why I'm going to tell you no. And you understand, she said, why I'm going to go anyway. Something moved through his expression. Not quite a smile. Not quite exasperation. Some register of a person encountering an equal weight pushing in the opposite direction and finding the experience not unwelcome. I'll send 2 people with you, he said. 1, she said. He considered this for a moment. 1. She went that afternoon. The apartment on Capitol Hill was exactly as she'd left it the night of the engagement party. Glass of water on the kitchen counter, coat on the chair by the door, the particular stillness of a space that has been waiting. She moved through it efficiently, pulling the things that mattered into a bag. Her notebooks. 3 photographs. The small wooden box her mother had left her. The policy report she'd written in her own time over the past 2 years. The ones she'd showed no one. The ones that were good and that she knew were good. She was in the bedroom reaching for the wooden box when she heard the front door. The Campbell security man, patient, quiet, stationed in the hall, opened the door the way someone does when they expect what's on the other side to be nothing, and then the sound that followed was wrong. Heavy footsteps. More than one person. Preston's voice. Low, controlled, doing that reasonable register thing that meant something was running underneath it. She's here. I just need 5 minutes. I'm not here to cause trouble. I just need to... She came out of the bedroom with the wooden box under her arm. Preston stopped when he saw her. The security man was between them, hands loose, positioned correctly, not escalating but present. Preston looked at the guard and then looked at Mara, and something in his face cycled through several things in quick succession. Mara. Her name from his mouth was different too. Everything it had ever been. Affection, ownership, an understanding of her soft places. You don't have to do this. Whatever he told you, whatever story you've decided to... Preston. He stopped. I found the photographs, she said. The silence that followed was very specific. She had found them 3 months ago. On his laptop, A folder nested inside a folder nested inside a folder, the way careful people hide things. She hadn't said anything. She hadn't known what to do with what she'd found, and not knowing had curdled into a kind of paralysis. And paralysis had become the bruised wrist, and the bruised wrist had become last night, which had become all of this. The photographs were of a man named Grant Atkins, Preston's father, with people she didn't recognize, in places she couldn't identify. But the documents in the photographs, the ones spread on the table in the images, partially visible, bearing logos she had eventually been able to identify with enough searching, those she had recognized eventually. Campbell Defense Supplier documentation, with dates that didn't line up with any public record she could find. Preston's face had gone very still. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "Yes, you do." The security man was watching. Preston looked at the guard and then looked at Mara, and the reasonable register cracked slightly. Not into rage, not yet, into something colder. A calculation. A man deciding how much she knew and how much he needed to know she knew, and what happened next based on the math. "You should be careful," he said. "I've been careful for 2 years," she said. "I'm tired." She walked past him. She walked out of her apartment with the wooden box and the bag and the notebooks and the policy reports, and she didn't look back, and the security man followed at her shoulder, and Preston stood in the doorway of a life that was ending and didn't say another word. She didn't fully understand what she'd seen in those photographs yet. She didn't know the name C-47. She didn't know what Evelyn Campbell had died trying to expose. But sitting in the back of the car on the way back to the estate, with the wooden box in her lap and the city moving past the windows, she felt the specific sensation of having set something in motion that could not be unset. A stone rolled from the top of something very steep. She looked out at the iron gates as the car turned into the estate's long drive. They closed behind her. She thought about what he'd said that morning in the East Wing bedroom on the first day. Time to figure out what you want to do next. She still didn't have the full answer, but for the first time in 2 years, she thought she might be standing somewhere that would let her find it. The photographs were still on her phone, backed up 3 places she'd learned not to tell anyone about. And in 3 days, Preston Atkins would find a way past the estate's security to get into her bedroom. Not with rage, but with a file, a name, a truth that would change every assumption she'd built about Nolan Campbell. And the question she'd been asking, whose side am I really on, was about to become the most dangerous question she'd ever asked. 3 days passed. Mara learned the estate the way you learn a language you weren't supposed to need. By immersion, by necessity, by the slow accumulation of small details that eventually added up to something like fluency. She learned that Diane arrived at 5:45 every morning and that the sound of the kitchen starting up, the particular knock of the old copper pipes, the coffee grinder's low growl, happened exactly 12 minutes later. She learned that the security rotation changed at 6 and midnight and that the man on the North Corridor night shift had a habit of pausing near the third window to look at his phone, which meant there was a gap of about 40 seconds in the visual coverage of the garden path. She didn't know why she was cataloging these things. Old habit. Her father had raised her in rooms where information was currency, and she'd learned early to collect it reflexively, the way other people collected reassurance. She learned that Nolan was awake before dawn every day, and that he spent the first hour of the morning in a room on the ground floor that held nothing but a desk, a lamp, and what appeared to be several thousand pages of documents and stacked files. She knew this because on the second morning she'd come downstairs at 5:30, unable to sleep, and had seen the thin line of light under that door. And on the third morning she'd done the same thing, and the light was there again. And she'd stood in the dark hallway for a moment, with her hand flat against the wall, and thought about the particular loneliness of a man who worked through the hours when the world was still unconscious, because sleeping was something that had stopped being simple. She didn't knock. She went to the kitchen and made her own coffee and sat at the counter with her notebooks and worked on the environmental policy brief she'd been drafting for 18 months. The one her father had told her was a hobby, the one she'd kept writing anyway. On the third day, Nolan came into the kitchen at 6:15 and found her there and didn't say anything about it. He poured coffee. He looked at her notebooks with the quick, assessing look of a man who processes information for a living. "Water rights legislation," he said. It wasn't a question. "Columbia Basin allocation conflicts," she said. "Indigenous land claims versus agricultural lobbying. It's a mess." He looked at it for another moment. Your analysis of the federal precedent is wrong. She looked up. Not the direction, he said. The timeline. The 2019 amendment superseded the case you're citing, shifts your entire legal framework by about 4 years. She stared at him. How do you know water rights law? I know everything I've had to fight about in court. He took his coffee to the door. The brief is good. Fix the timeline. He left. She looked down at the notebook for a long moment. Then she pulled out her laptop and looked up the 2019 amendment. He was right. She fixed the timeline. That evening, Preston got through the gate. She didn't know how at first. Nolan's security team found the breach 20 minutes after the fact. A catering delivery that had been scheduled 3 weeks prior, back when the estate was still preparing for an event that no longer existed, and someone on the vendor side who had accepted a number with too many zeros from a man with good teeth and no visible conscience. The delivery van had provided cover. Preston hadn't come in with the van. He'd come in behind it, through a service entrance on the east side that backed up to the garden wall. He was in her room when she came upstairs after dinner. She opened the door and he was sitting in the chair by the window. Her chair, the one she'd pulled close to the glass to read by the last 2 evenings. And he had one leg crossed over the other in a posture that said, I've been waiting and I can wait longer. He looked, in the low light, almost exactly like the man she'd said yes to 14 months ago. Almost. The edges were different now that she knew what the edges were. She didn't scream. She didn't step back. She came in, left the door open behind her, and stood with the full length of the room between them. How did you get in here? She said. Doesn't matter. It matters to me. There are things that matter more. He uncrossed his legs and leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and the posture was familiar. It was the one he used when he was trying to look earnest. She had thought it was earnestness once. I'm not here to fight with you. I need you to listen to me. You're in a man's house without permission at 9 o'clock at night, and you're going to tell me what we're here to do. Something tightened around his eyes. Mara. Say what you came to say. He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket and set something on the small table beside the chair. A manila folder, creased at the corners like it had been carried a long time. You found photographs on my laptop, he said. The air in the room changed temperature. You've been in my apartment, she said. I went back after you left. I needed to know what you'd taken. He looked at the folder. I know you copied the files. The metadata showed. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do. His voice was even. That was the thing about Preston when he was being strategic. He got quieter, not softer. Quieter the way a compressed thing is quiet. I'm not here to threaten you. I want you to understand what you're actually standing in the middle of before you do something with those files that you can't take back. She looked at the folder on the table. Evelyn Campbell didn't die in an accident, he said. The sentence landed in the room and stayed there. She could hear the security man somewhere in the corridor below. She could hear her own breathing. You don't know anything about Evelyn Campbell, she said. I know she found something she wasn't supposed to find. And I know that the people who made sure she didn't talk about it are still very much operational, and they are not the kind of people who make exceptions for women who are sleeping in the wrong man's house. I'm not sleeping with Mara. The name from his mouth, flat and deliberate. It doesn't matter what you're actually doing. It matters what they think you have access to. He nodded toward the folder. Open it. She didn't move for a long moment. Then she crossed the room and picked up the folder. Inside were 12 pages. Printed, not originals. Surveillance photographs. Grainy, time-stamped, the kind taken from a distance. Financial records with several names highlighted in yellow. And a single page at the back, typed, no letterhead, that was a summary of something labeled at the top in red ink. C47 Disposition Report. Classified. She read the summary. She read it again. Weapons prototypes, she said. Advanced targeting systems. Experimental. Not cleared for sale, not cleared for export, not cleared for anything except controlled destruction per a specific military oversight agreement. Preston's voice had gone flat. Factual. Like he was reading from something. Nolan Campbell ordered them destroyed in 2019, signed the order himself. The destruction was logged, certified, and filed. But the prototypes weren't destroyed. They were pulled from the facility the night before the scheduled destruction and replaced with dummy hardware. The certification was filed against the dummies. The real prototypes went into a private transfer chain. Where? He looked at her. That's the question, isn't it? Preston. Overseas buyers. Multiple transactions. The transfer chain runs through 3 shell companies. One of them. He paused, and in the pause she saw something she didn't expect. Not guilt. Not exactly. Something more complicated than that. More like a man who has been carrying a specific weight for a long time and has mixed feelings about setting it down. One of them is registered under my father. The folder felt different in her hands now, heavier. Your father, she said. Grant Atkins. Yes. And you've known this. I've known pieces of it for 2 years. His voice was even, but his jaw was tight, the muscles just below the ear, doing the thing they did when he was controlling something. Not all of it. Not the scope. But enough. She looked at him. Why are you telling me this? Because your father's name is also in those files. The room was very quiet. Say that again, she said. Richard Whitmore. His signature is on a document dated 8 months after the theft. A document that formally certified the destruction records as valid for regulatory purposes. He knew the prototypes weren't actually destroyed. He signed off on a false certification to keep the record clean. Preston stood up from the chair. He didn't steal the weapons, but he helped cover the cover-up, which makes him part of it. She set the folder down on the table very carefully, the way you set down something you're not sure is stable. Her father's name on a page, her father's signature on a false document, and a file about stolen weapons that a woman was killed over. Why are you telling me this? She said again. Same question, different meaning. Because Nolan Campbell is going to find out. Preston moved toward the door, stopping at the far edge of the room. He's been looking for 5 years. You know that. Whatever you think of me, whatever you think is happening in this house, he has people looking, and when he finds those files, your father goes to prison. And the only way Richard Whitmore doesn't take the full weight of this is if someone gets to the C-47 file first and shapes the story before Campbell does. You want me to protect my father. I want you to understand your position. My position, she repeated softly. You're living in the house of the man whose wife was killed as a direct result of a conspiracy your father helped cover. That is your position. She looked at the door, the open door, the corridor beyond it, the faint sound of the security man below. Get out, she said. Mara, get out of this room. She turned to look at him, and something in her face made him stop. Not anger. Something past anger. A kind of absolute clarity that didn't have room for his name or his posture or his careful voice. You walked into this house to tell me my father helped cover up your father's crime, and you framed it as doing me a favor. Get out. He held her gaze for a moment, then he adjusted his jacket and walked through the door. She listened to his footsteps until she couldn't hear them anymore. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed and looked at the folder on the table. She sat there for a long time. She didn't go to Nolan that night. She thought about it. She turned the thought over in her hands and examined it from every angle. The floor, the folder, the window with the gate visible in the dark. She tried to assemble the right version of the conversation, where it started, what she said, what she didn't yet know that she'd need to know before she could say anything useful. She fell asleep sometime after 2 with the folder in her lap and woke at 5 to the sound of the kitchen pipes. She spent the morning in Nolan's library. The library was one of the rooms that was clearly alive, used, inhabited, evidence of a mind in consistent motion, books pulled and returned at angles, papers in organized clusters on the reading table, a whiteboard on the south wall with what appeared to be a corporate structure diagram that had been added to over time in 3 different colors of marker. She stood in front of the whiteboard for a long time. The diagram showed Campbell Defense at the center, subsidiaries branching out from it. Several arms she recognized, manufacturing, R&D, 2 foreign partnerships. And on the far right, connected by a dotted line in red marker, a box labeled simply with initials, G.A. Grant Atkins. He already knew, or he suspected. The red dotted line wasn't confirmation. It was inquiry, but it had been drawn by someone who was asking the right question, which meant Nolan was moving, which meant the timeline on everything was shorter than she'd understood last night. She heard the front door open and close. She went to the window. A man she didn't recognize was walking up the drive, let through the gate by security without being stopped, which meant he was expected. He was about 50, wore a rain jacket over a button-down, carried a slim briefcase. The walk of someone who made a living in offices where things were decided. She went downstairs. Diane intercepted her in the main corridor with the gentle efficiency of a woman who had been managing the household's human traffic for 15 years. "Mr. Campbell is in a meeting," she said. "With who?" "Mr. Reeves, legal." "How long has this been scheduled?" Diane looked at her with the specific expression of someone who finds a question more interesting than they expected. 2 days, she said. 2 days. Legal had been called the morning after the engagement party. The morning after Nolan had looked at the bruise on her wrist, and the morning after, Mara understood now, he had apparently also called his attorneys. "Is it about Campbell defense?" Mara said. "I'm not in a position to—" "Diane." The woman paused. The way she paused suggested she was weighing something. "Mr. Campbell's legal matters are complex," she said. "They have been for some time. That was all. But it was enough." Mara went back to the library and sat down at the reading table and thought carefully. Preston had found her in this house to tell her something. That alone required examination. Preston did nothing without a reason. He had crossed a security perimeter and taken a significant risk specifically to put the C-47 information in her hands. Not because he was protecting her, not because of whatever remained of their former relationship, because he needed her to do something with it, something he couldn't do himself. What did Preston Atkins need that required Mara Whitmore in Nolan Campbell's house? She sat with the question. Then it hit her. The files. Preston knew she'd taken files from his laptop. He'd told her that. But he didn't know what she'd taken. She'd been careful, pulled only the photographs, left the folder structure intact. He knew she had images of his father with Campbell defense documents. He didn't know how much she'd been able to read in those images. He didn't know whether she had the names visible on those documents or just the logos. He'd come to her to find out. The whole thing. The folder. The C-47 summary. Her father's name. It was an exchange. A trade. He'd given her something real to get a read on how much she actually knew. She thought about his face when she'd said, "I found the photographs," the very specific silence that had followed. He'd been calculating, and she'd let him see more than she meant to. She went up to her suite and pulled out the backup drive she'd carried in the wooden box from her apartment. She plugged it into her laptop and opened the image files she'd pulled from Preston's laptop 3 months ago. She zoomed in on the Campbell defense documents in the background of the photographs. The logos were clear, the dates were partially visible. 2 of the 3 names on the header line were readable, a project designation and a signatory. The project designation meant nothing to her in isolation. The signatory line said N. Campbell, which she'd known, and below it another name, only partially in frame, that she'd previously dismissed as unimportant because she'd only been able to read the first 5 letters. She stared at those 5 letters now. G-R-A-N. Grant. She had had it the whole time. She hadn't known what she was looking at. She sat back in her chair. She had the files. Not the full C-47 report. That was still out there somewhere, in whatever archive Nolan was building or had already built. But she had photographs with Grant Atkins in frame, with Campbell defense documents visible, with dates that placed him at a facility meeting 3 weeks before the theft. She had enough to place him at the table. And her father had signed the false certification 8 months later. She thought about Richard Whitmore. She tried to do it the way she'd learned to do hard thinking, without the emotional static, without the things she'd wanted from him that she'd eventually stopped wanting, just the clean lines of what was true. Her father had known. He had signed a document that protected the people who had stolen weapons that had likely gotten people killed. He had done this because it was profitable to do it, or because someone had made it dangerous not to, or some combination of both. He had also arranged her engagement to the son of the man who had orchestrated the whole thing. She didn't know if that was coincidence. She was starting to think it wasn't. She was still sitting there when Nolan knocked. He came in at her answer and read the room in the way he did. Quick, complete. The expression telling her that whatever he'd walked in expecting, it wasn't this. "You look like someone who just finished a very bad calculation," he said. "How is your lawyer?" she said. He went still, brief but visible. "Why?" "You've been meeting with legal since the morning after the engagement party. That's 2 days before Preston broke into this house, and 2 days before he told me about C-47. The name landed between them like something physical. She watched his face. His face didn't change. That was information. "How do you know that name?" he said. "Preston told me last night. He was in my room when I came upstairs." She held up a hand at the shift in his expression. "Security found the breach about 20 minutes later. He was already gone. He sat in my chair and handed me a folder and told me about stolen weapons prototypes and shell companies and—" She paused. "And my father's signature on a false certification." The silence in the room had a specific quality now. "You knew my father was involved," she said. "Mara, did you know before the engagement party?" He looked at her. His jaw was tight. The muscles below the ear, same place Preston's did it, but with a different energy underneath. Chatri, less calculation, more something that was actually painful. "I had a name on a document," he said. "Unconfirmed. I didn't know the extent of—" "Did you bring me into this house because you needed access to Whitmore Group files?" The question hit the room and stayed there. She watched him absorb it, watched him decide something. "No," he said. "Nolan. I brought you into this house because you had a bruise on your wrist." His voice was low, controlled, but with a vibration underneath it now, the kind that happens when something true is being compressed into a small space. "That is the whole of why I did it that night. What I knew about your father was a shape on a page. You were a person standing in my ballroom. Those are not the same thing." She looked at him. She wanted to believe it. She was aware of wanting to believe it, which was reason enough to be careful. "But you looked," she said. "After I got here. You pulled records on Whitmore Group." A beat. "Yes," he said. And your father is deeper in this than a single certification." He moved to the window. He didn't look out at the gate this time. He looked at the floor, the particular looking at floor that means a person is actually looking inward. The C-47 file, the destruction protocols, the shell company structure, the offshore accounts that routed payment. There's a paper chain, Mara. It goes back 6 years. Your father was brought in early, not as the architect, but as the protection. The man who could keep the regulatory record clean. She was quiet. "He traded that protection for preferential access to Campbell Defense contracts," Nolan said. 17 contracts over 5 years, worth approximately $400 million to Whitmore Group. She did the math without meaning to. 18 months of engagement, 14 months of a relationship before that. 2.5 years of her life offered up by a man who had already been in business with the Atkins family for at least 2 years before Preston had appeared at any function her father had invited her to. "He introduced me to Preston," she said. Nolan turned from the window. "He set up that relationship," she said. She said it out loud, not because she needed to tell Nolan, but because she needed to hear it in a room where there was another person, needed the air to carry the weight of it. "He introduced me to Preston and encouraged the relationship and pushed for the engagement because having me married to Preston Atkins kept his access to the contract secure. Because if the families were joined, it was harder to unwind the—" She stopped. She breathed. "I was a contract clause," she said. The words came out steady. She hadn't expected them to be steady. She'd expected something to break in her voice, some fissure along the line where she'd spent 28 years believing her father loved her in his limited, pragmatic, insufficient way. But her voice stayed even. Maybe because she'd known this, on some unexamined level, for longer than last night. Maybe because the bruise on her wrist had always been downstream of this. Nolan was looking at her, not with pity. She would have left the room if it was pity. Something more careful than that. Like he was watching a structure bear a weight he'd been afraid it might not bear and was watching it hold. "The C-47 file is the core of it," he said. "The weapon prototypes, the false certification, the cover-up that followed Evelyn's death. If that file goes to federal agencies with the supporting documentation, the whole structure falls. You've been building the documentation for 4 years. The meeting with your lawyer. We're close," he said. "Weeks, maybe less. The financial chain is almost fully mapped." He paused. "Your father's role will be part of the filing." She absorbed this. "You're telling me this now. I'm telling you this because you deserve to hear it before it happened, because you are not a contract clause. And because whatever you decide to do with the information, you should be the one deciding. Outside, the Seattle sky had gone the particular shade of gray that preceded real rain, not the daily drizzle, the kind that meant it. She thought about Richard Whitmore standing at the bar the night of the engagement party, amber glass in hand, calculating. She thought about the 17 contracts and the 400 million, and the man across from her who had spent 4 years building a case while barely leaving his own house, who had nearly died at the gate where his wife had been killed, who had knocked before he entered her room and told her the 2019 amendment superseded her legal framework and said you deserved to hear it. She thought about the backup drive on her laptop, the photographs with Grant Atkins, the 5 letters, Grant. I have something you need, she said. He waited. On my laptop. Photographs I pulled from Preston's computer 3 months ago. Grant Atkins at a facility with Campbell defense documents in frame. The dates place him at a meeting 3 weeks before the theft. She met his eyes. I didn't know what I had until last night. Something moved across his face. Not excitement, something quieter than that. The way a man who has been working towards something for 4 years looks when a piece slides into the place it was supposed to occupy. I'll need to copy them, he said. I know. She paused. And I need something from you. What? I need to be in the room when this goes forward, not as a witness, not as your ward or your... She gestured at the window, at the world outside, at the mystery woman headline still circulating. Whatever the press thinks I am, as someone who understands what we have and what it means and who made what decision when. She looked at him steadily. I need to matter in this. He looked at her for a long moment. You already do, he said. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't a concession. It was a man who said what he meant, looking at a woman and saying what was true. And something about the plainness of it hit her harder than a more decorated answer would have. She nodded. She went to get her laptop. She was at the door when she heard him say her name. Quiet, the particular way he said it that she'd been cataloging without intending to. She turned. He was looking at the window now, not at her. His hands were at his sides, the silver at his temples catching the last of the gray light. Evelyn found the C-47 file on her own, he said. She was trying to protect the company. She didn't tell me because she thought I'd try to handle it through channels, and channels would get her killed. He was quiet for a moment. She was right that it would get her killed. The room was very still. She was trying to protect you, Mara said. Yes. His voice had something in it now that no amount of control could fully flatten. And I didn't protect her. She stood in the doorway with her hand on the frame, and she looked at the back of a man who had been standing in front of that window alone for 5 years with that sentence in his chest. She didn't say it was his fault, because he wouldn't believe it, and because telling people the simple version of a complicated grief was a kindness they hadn't asked for. She didn't say it wasn't his fault, for the same reason. She said, she's in the case, Nolan. What she found. What she knew. When this goes forward, she's in it. He didn't turn around, but she saw his shoulders change. She went to get the laptop. She was in the library pulling the backup drive when the security system on the ground floor let out a short alert tone. Not the full alarm, just the proximity warning for the outer wall. She heard the shift supervisor's voice on the hall panel, checking with his team. Diane appeared in the library doorway. Miss Whitmore? Her voice was its usual precise instrument, but something in the edges of it was different. We have a situation at the East Gate. What kind? A vehicle. Parked on the service road for the past 40 minutes. The security team ran the plates. Diane paused. It's registered to Elias Mercer. He's asking to speak with you. Mara looked up from the laptop. Elias Mercer. Stanford. 12 years ago. The man who had been her first understanding of what it meant to actually care about something. The activist. The one who still cared, still fought, still believed the work mattered. The man she hadn't spoken to in 4 years, who had reached out twice last year through mutual connections with vague messages about Campbell defense she hadn't known how to answer. The man who, she realized now with a cold, specific clarity, would have had exactly the right reason to make contact with her now. Because if Elias Mercer was outside these gates asking for her, it meant someone had sent him. And the only person who would have sent him was the person who wanted something from inside this house that Mara hadn't yet given. Her father. She put the backup drive in her pocket. "Tell Mr. Mercer," she said, "that I'll be out in 10 minutes. Diane nodded. Mara looked down at the laptop, at the C-47 photographs, at the documentation she'd just promised to hand to a man who had spent 4 years trying to dismantle the conspiracy that killed the woman he loved. 10 minutes to decide whose side she was really on. The backup drive was warm in her pocket, and outside the iron gate, an old friend was waiting with someone else's agenda in his hands. She gave herself 10 minutes. She used 8 of them. The first 3 she spent standing at the library window, watching the east gate from the second floor, watching the shape of a black sedan parked on the service road with its engine off and its lights out. Like whoever was inside had been taught that stillness was the same thing as invisibility. It wasn't raining yet, but the sky had the pressure of rain in it, that particular gray-green weight that Seattle carried before it finally broke open. She used the next 3 minutes pulling everything off the backup drive onto the laptop's encrypted partition. The photographs, the partial documents, the notes she'd made in her own handwriting in the margins of the policy brief where she'd been secretly cross-referencing names for the past 2 weeks without fully admitting to herself what she was cross-referencing them against. She did it fast. The way she'd learned to do things, she wasn't sure she'd have the nerve to finish if she slowed down. The last 2 minutes she used standing in the middle of the library with her hands at her sides, breathing. The drive stayed in her pocket. She went outside. The garden air was cold and smelled like wet iron from the gate and cut grass from the grounds crew's work that afternoon. 2 of Nolan's security team walked her to the east gate without being asked. They materialized from positions she hadn't identified, which told her they'd been watching the sedan for the full 40 minutes and had already decided on a protocol. She didn't tell them to stay back. She didn't tell them anything. She walked to the gate, and the gate opened 3 feet, and she stepped through to the service road. The sedan's door opened. Elias Mercer looked almost exactly like he had at 22, which was the kind of thing that happened to people who had spent their lives angry about the right things and hadn't had to waste energy on performance. He was tall, thin in the way of someone who forgot to eat when he was working, with close cropped hair going gray at the edges and eyes that had always been too direct for comfortable conversation. He was wearing a field jacket that had seen field work. He looked at her the way he'd always looked at her, like she was a problem he found genuinely interesting. "Mara," he said. "Elias." She stopped 6 feet from him, close enough to talk, far enough that the 2 security men behind her were still within reasonable range. "You drove yourself." Seemed important to keep the circle small. He glanced at the security team. "Can we have a minute?" "We can have whatever we're having right here." He absorbed that, nodded once. "Okay?" He put his hands in his jacket pockets, the gesture of a man showing he wasn't holding anything, which was the kind of careful Elias had always been. "I've been looking at Campbell Defense for 3 years, specifically the overseas manufacturing partnerships. There are facilities in 2 countries operating under licensing agreements that don't line up with anything in the public record. No export permits, no congressional notification. Product moving through ports that—" "Elias." He stopped. "Why are you here?" she said. Not the question under the question itself. He looked at her. The directness in his eyes shifted slightly, from the version of direct that was enthusiasm to the version that was something harder to name. "Richard called me," he said. There it was. She kept her face still. She'd had practice. "When?" she said. 4 days ago. He said you were inside Campbell's estate and that he said you were in over your head, that you didn't understand what you'd gotten into, and that someone you trusted needed to get you out before Campbell used you and discarded you, and you ended up collateral in something you hadn't signed up for." Elias paused. "He said you needed help, and you believed him." "I believed he was scared." "That's not the same thing." Elias was quiet for a moment. The service road was empty in both directions. Somewhere over the estate wall she could hear the sound of the grounds crew wrapping up for the evening, the distant mechanical sound of a cart. "He also said you might have files," Elias said, "documents you'd taken from Preston Atkins. He said if those files contained what he thought they contained, and they went to federal agencies without context, without the full picture—" He paused again. Something in his face was working through something. "He said you'd be implicated." She looked at him. "Say that last part again," she said. "He said your name was on documents." that you'd been brought into some of the Whitmore Group compliance work 2 years ago on a consulting basis, unofficial, and that your signature about it. I never signed anything for Whitmore Group. He says you did. A regulatory review in 2022. Environmental compliance, your area. He says he had you sign off on a consolidated subsidiary report, and you didn't know what was in the full package. The service road, the cold air, the pressure of rain that hadn't come yet. She thought about 2022. She thought about the consolidated subsidiary report. She remembered it. Environmental impact statements for 3 of her father's smaller holdings, and she'd reviewed the environmental sections and signed the review certification and handed it back to his assistant without looking at the cover sheet because she'd been asked to review environmental data, not corporate structure, and she had trusted. She stopped that sentence before it finished. She had trusted him. He buried my signature in a compliance document that touched the C-47 cover-up, she said. Not a question. Elias didn't answer. That was its own answer. What does he want? She said. He wants the photographs you took from Preston's laptop, and he wants you to come home. The word home from Elias's mouth in her father's service was such a precise piece of architecture that she almost admired it. The use of a man she'd once loved to deliver a word designed to activate something old and biological in her. Efficient. Her father had always been efficient. He wants me to hand him evidence that places his partner's son at the scene of a weapons theft, she said. And in exchange, he'll, what? Make my name disappear from a document I didn't know I'd signed. He said he could protect you. She laughed. It came out small and without warmth. He said he could protect me. Elias flinched slightly. I know how it sounds. Do you know what the C-47 file is? A pause. In general terms, weapons prototypes, illegal transfer chain. Evelyn Campbell found it, Mara said. She found the file, and she was killed for it. The car explosion at these gates 5 years ago. That wasn't an accident. And the man who arranged it is Grant Atkins, whose family my father has been protecting for 4 years through falsified regulatory documents. She watched Elias absorb this. My father isn't scared of what happens to me. He's scared of what happens to him when those files go to federal agencies. That's the whole call. That's every word he said to you. Elias stood very still. Did he know? Elias said. When he asked you to sign that compliance review, did he know what it was adjacent to? Yes, she said. The words sat between them on the service road. Elias looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the gate. Then he looked down at the ground, and she watched him do the internal work of a man who has made a decision about someone he respected and is discovering the decision was made on bad information. She recognized it. She'd been doing variations of the same work for days. I'm sorry, he said. For coming here, I didn't... Did you tell him I was here before he called you? Did you reach out to him? He looked up. No. He found me. How? He said he'd been tracking my research on Campbell Defense, that he'd seen my last published piece and recognized the sourcing patterns, and knew I'd been talking to people inside the company. He shook his head. I thought he was trying to warn me off. When he said you were inside the estate, I thought, you thought you could do 2 things at once. She said it without accusation, just the shape of it. Get me out and get access to whatever I had. Elias had the grace not to deny it. The research matters, he said quietly. The weapons trafficking matters. People are dead because of that transfer chain, and not just Evelyn Campbell. There are end-use reports from 2 conflict zones that... I know, she said. That's why I'm not leaving. He looked at her. Go back and tell my father I'm staying, she said. Tell him I didn't have the files he thinks I have. Tell him whatever keeps him from doing something that accelerates this before we're ready. She paused. And Elias, the research you have, the overseas facilities, the port records, the end-use reports, I need copies. Mara, you came here because this matters. I'm telling you it matters to me too. So give me what you have and let me be useful with it. He studied her for a moment. Then he went to his car and came back with a thumb drive that he held out to her. This is 2 years of work, he said. She took it. The facility in the second location, he said. There's a name in the port records that doesn't appear in any Campbell Defense public documentation. A liaison. Someone who was present at multiple transfer points. What name? He hesitated. Elias. Diane Rourke, he said. She went very still. She's listed as a logistics coordinator in the port manifest, he said. 7 separate entries over 18 months. I assumed it was a different person with a similar... Mara turned and walked back through the gate. She was moving fast enough that the security team had to adjust their pace to stay with her. She crossed the garden in the dark, the wet grass cold through the thin soles of her shoes, and she was thinking with the specific focused clarity of a person who has just had a floor open beneath them and is running toward the only solid thing in the room. Diane Rourke. The woman who had managed this house for 15 years. The woman who appeared at precisely the right moment, with precisely the right information and precisely the right absence when things were discussed that she wasn't supposed to hear. The woman who had told Mara 2 days ago that Nolan's legal meetings had been scheduled since the morning after the engagement party, which was information that had guided Mara toward trusting Nolan's timeline and trusting Nolan's plan and trusting Nolan's lawyer and the laptop. She'd left the laptop in the library. She ran. Through the garden door, down the main corridor, past the dining room. The library door was closed and she pushed through it and the laptop was there, on the reading table exactly where she'd left it. She crossed the room in 4 steps and checked the encrypted partition. The files were there. She stood over the laptop breathing hard, doing the check twice, 3 times, confirming the timestamps on the last access and the last modification. Nothing had been touched. No one had been in the library since she'd left. The files were intact. She stood there with her hand on the table and her heart doing something unpleasant in her chest and thought about timing. She'd been outside for 11 minutes. Was Diane the kind of person who needed 11 minutes? Was Diane the kind of person who would move that quickly, or the kind who had been playing a longer and more patient game? She thought about the whiteboard in this room, the corporate structure diagram, the red dotted line labeled GA. She thought about who had access to this room. She thought about Nolan, who had spent 4 years building a case and trusted the woman who managed his household and had never, as far as Mara could tell, looked at the person 3 feet away from him every single day. She closed the laptop and picked it up. She went to find Nolan. He was in the ground floor room with the documents, the door open for the first time since she'd arrived. His lawyer was gone. The desk was covered in open files, and he was standing over them with a red pen in his hand, and he looked up when she came through the door and read something in her face immediately. "What happened?" he said. She told him. All of it. Elias, her father's call, the compliance document with her buried signature, the thumb drive, the port manifests, the name Diane Rourke, appearing 7 times in 18 months as a logistics coordinator in transfer records for stolen weapons. She said it plainly and quickly without editorializing because she didn't have the bandwidth to manage his reaction and manage her own at the same time, and because she'd learned in the past week that Nolan Campbell processed information better when she gave it to him clean. He didn't say anything for a long moment after she finished. He put the red pen down. "Port manifests," he said. His voice was controlled. Precisely, deliberately controlled. The way a thing is controlled when the alternative is something that would break furniture. 7 entries. Elias has the documentation. Dates. I don't have the specific dates yet. The drive is... She pulled out Elias's thumb drive. "Here. I haven't gone through it." He looked at the drive. Then he looked at the door. His eyes did something she hadn't seen them do. A rapid scan of the corridor, the window, the position of the desk. A man who has just recalculated every room he's standing in. "She's been in this house for 15 years, he said. "I know." "She managed the estate when Evelyn was here. She was here the day Evelyn..." He stopped. His jaw was doing the controlled thing. "She was here the day of the explosion." The sentence landed in the room. Mara had arrived at this thought 30 seconds after Elias had said the name on the service road. She had not allowed herself to say it out loud until this moment, because saying it out loud made it a thing that had to be dealt with, and there were several directions in which dealing with it could go very badly very quickly. "We don't know what her role was," Mara said carefully. "Port manifests place her as a logistics coordinator. That's operational involvement in the transfer chain. It doesn't necessarily mean she was involved in... She was the one who told me Evelyn had gone out that night." He said it flat. No effect. I didn't know Evelyn had left the estate. I was on a call with a defense contractor in Frankfurt. Diane came to my office and told me Evelyn had gone to a dinner and was on her way home. 40 minutes later, the gate cameras picked up the explosion. He looked at his hand, the hand that had gone into the burning car. I always thought I knew something was wrong with the timeline. I could never locate the original call record for the Frankfurt meeting. It was scheduled through Diane's system. The contractors confirmed the meeting existed, but the duration was always unclear. He picked up the red pen, set it down again. If she knew Evelyn was going to leave that night and she knew the timeline, Nolan, she said his name the way you say a name to anchor someone. We need to move carefully. If she knows we know, or suspects we're close, where is she right now? Where is she? The urgency in his voice was not panic. It was the opposite of panic. It was the sound of a very controlled man arriving at the edge of what control could hold. Mara pulled out her phone and called the extension she'd memorized in her first 2 days in the estate. It rang 4 times. 5. No answer. They looked at each other. He was moving before she finished the thought, out of the document room and into the corridor, and she was 2 steps behind him, and they went through the house at a pace that was just below running. The east wing, the kitchen, the administrative suite where Diane kept her own workspace, the small room off the main corridor where she managed the household scheduling systems. The room was empty. The desk had been cleared, not tidied, cleared. The surface was bare in the specific way of a surface from which things have been removed rather than organized. The computer was there, but when Molon hit the spacebar, the login screen appeared with a new user account, the kind of account that exists when the previous one has been deleted. The scheduling system, the security rotation logs, 5 years of household management data, gone. Nolan stood at the desk with his hands flat on the empty surface and breathed. Mara watched him breathe. She was running her own calculations. Diane had heard something, or had access to something that had told her the timeline was closing. Elias's arrival at the gate might have triggered it, or the legal meeting, or Mara's conversation with Nolan an hour ago, if the room had been monitored in some way that neither of them had thought to check. She pulled up the port manifest drive on her phone. No, the laptop. The laptop had the decryption she needed. She opened the laptop on Diane's empty desk and inserted Elias's drive. The port manifest loaded. She went straight for the dates. The 7 Diane Rourke entries spanned 18 months, the most recent one 14 months ago. She cross-referenced it against what she knew of the C-47 timeline. Prototype stolen, certifications falsified, Evelyn killed, investigation stalled, cover-up maintained. The last entry was 3 weeks before Evelyn's death. The last logistics entry, she said, 3 weeks before Evelyn died. She coordinated a transfer at the port of Tacoma. The manifest shows she was accompanying a container listed as decommissioned defense equipment. She looked up. Not the weapons themselves. The prototypes were already through by then. This was something else. The container manifest lists electronic components. Triggering components, Nolan said. His voice was very quiet now. For a shaped charge. The kind you'd need to... He stopped. The bomb, she said. He said nothing. She didn't just work for them, Mara said. She sourced materials for what they used to kill Evelyn. The room was absolutely still. Nolan straightened up from the desk. He moved to the window. Outside, the grounds crew had long since gone, the garden sitting dark and empty under the heavy sky, the east gate visible in the distance with its iron frame and its security light. She watched his shoulders. She had seen this man compress enormous things into very small containers. She had seen him manage conversations that could have detonated rooms. She had watched him stand at a window night after night, carrying the specific weight of a man who had survived something that had redesigned him at a molecular level. What moved through him in the 30 seconds at that window was different. It was the difference between a wound that had been healing wrong and the moment it was cut open to heal correctly. The specific violence of that, the necessary violence. When he turned back to the room, he was pale under the controlled expression. The gate cameras from the night of the explosion, he said. The original footage. I requested it from the federal investigators, and they returned it as part of the incident file, but the timestamp on the file was... There was a gap. 11 minutes. I flagged it at the time, but the investigator said it was a system error. He looked at the empty desk. Diane managed the estate security system. She deleted 11 minutes of footage, which means whatever those 11 minutes showed, his phone buzzed. He looked at it. His face did something she hadn't seen it do before. Not the controlled thing, not the pained thing. Something that was neither of those, a kind of stunned, cold, arriving at a conclusion flatness that was almost worse than visible emotion because it said the emotion was so large it had nowhere left to go. He turned the phone to show her. A text from an unknown number, no greeting, no signature. 8 words. She's already talked to the federal task force. Tonight. Mara read it twice. Who sent this? She said. I don't know. Is it real? He was already dialing. She watched him wait through 2 rings. 3. Someone picked up. He said 2 words, a name she didn't recognize, and then listened for 45 seconds without speaking and then said thank you in a voice that had no warmth in it and hung up. It's real, he said. Diane contacted a federal agent she's been maintaining access to for 4 years. A handler, someone Grant Atkins put in place inside the task force that's been looking at Campbell Defense. She gave them a statement tonight. An hour ago, while we were... He stopped. She told them that she had witnessed Nolan Campbell ordering the destruction of files related to the C-47 disposition report, that he personally oversaw the falsification of records, that the order to eliminate Evelyn Campbell came from Nolan himself, because Evelyn had threatened to go public with information about his illegal weapons program. The room spun. Not physically, in the way a room spins when something has just fundamentally rearranged itself. She's framing you, Mara said. The obvious said out loud because it needed to be said out loud. Yes. For Evelyn's murder. Yes. With a handler inside the task force. Yes. She pressed both hands flat on the desk, breathed through it. How long before? They'll come for me in the morning, he said. Maybe sooner, depending on how quickly the handler moves the statement through the system. If he's motivated and has friends at the supervisory level, it could be tonight. Your lawyer. I need to call him. The documentation, the 4 years of, it's here, all of it. But if they arrest me before we can file, the documents go into evidence lockup, and the prosecutorial framing is already set. The story is already written before our version can be submitted. By the time we get a hearing, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. She understood chains of custody. She understood how evidence worked when the first story told was the one that shaped every subsequent interpretation. She understood that 4 years of careful documentation could be neutralized in 4 hours if the wrong person controlled the narrative. She picked up the laptop. She looked at Elias's drive. The port manifests. The 7 entries with Diane's name. The timestamp that placed her at a material transfer 3 weeks before the explosion. She looked at the photographs on the encrypted partition. Grant Atkins, the Campbell Defense documents, the dates. She looked at her own documents, the policy brief, the notebooks, and buried in the Notes app on her phone, the photograph she'd taken of the compliance review her father had asked her to sign in 2022. She'd photographed it on impulse the afternoon she'd signed it, something she couldn't explain at the time, some instinct that the document was more than it appeared. The full cover sheet with her signature and with the subsidiary listing that she'd been told was a standard environmental package, and that she now knew had been threaded through a structure connected to C-47. Her father had her signature on a falsified record. She had her father's scheme and a photograph of the cover sheet he didn't know she'd taken. She thought about what Elias had said. The research matters. People are dead. She thought about what Nolan had said. You deserve to hear it before it happened. She thought about Evelyn Campbell, who had found the file on her own and had tried to protect the company, and had tried to protect the man she loved and had been killed at the gate of her own home with sourced materials and a deleted 11 minutes of footage and 15 years of proximity. She thought about the bruise on her wrist that had started all of this. She had been a contract clause. She had been her father's asset, Preston's controlled variable, Elias's access point. She had spent 28 years being useful to people who had decided her value in advance of any conversation with her. She was done. Give me the 4 years of documentation, she said. Nolan looked at her. All of it, she said. Everything you have. The financial chain, the shell companies, the falsified certifications, everything. Give me copies right now. Mara, You're going to call your lawyer and you're going to prepare for the possibility that you're arrested tonight. She was moving as she spoke, pulling the external hard drive from the document room desk, the one she'd identified on her first day in this room as the primary backup system because she'd learned to identify exits and storage systems the way she'd learned to catalog security rotations. I'm going to take this documentation and the port manifests and the photographs and my father's compliance document, and I'm going to go to someone I know at the Seattle field office of the FBI who is not connected to any task force Grant Atkins has had 4 years to contaminate. You know someone at the FBI field office. My environmental policy work put me in contact with a senior agent 3 years ago on a water rights enforcement matter. She is meticulous, she is not connected to defense contractor oversight, and she is going to be in her office at 6 in the morning because she is always in her office at 6 in the morning. Mara plugged the external drive into the laptop and started the copy. If I can get this documentation to her before the handler files Diane's statement through the supervisory chain, we have a competing version of the story from a clean source. The task force handler can't bury it if it's already at the field office. They'll come after you, he said. Once it's in motion, I know. Your father, I know. If Diane has already spoken to people beyond the handler, Nolan. She looked at him across the desk, across the files, across all 4 years and 15 years and 5 years and 2 years, and all the weight that was stacked between the person he had been before the gate and the person she had been before the bruise. I know the risks. I'm choosing them. She held his gaze. You stopped something for me in a room full of people because you saw something that mattered. I'm returning the favor. That's all this is. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he crossed to the filing cabinet on the east wall and opened the bottom drawer with a key he kept on a chain he wore. He pulled out a second hard drive, older, heavily labeled in his own handwriting, and set it on the desk. The primary documentation, he said. Everything time-stamped and authenticated. The copies are in my lawyer's safe. These are the originals. She looked at the drive. Originals. In her hands. You trust me with the originals, she said. I trusted you with my name in every headline in the country the morning after the engagement party. He said it simply, the way he said things that were simply true. That was before I knew anything about you except that you covered a bruise with a bracelet and told the truth when you didn't have to. Outside, a sound she hadn't heard before from the estate, a car on the main drive, moving fast. Both their heads turned toward the window. Through the glass, headlights were sweeping the drive, not the careful angle of an expected arrival, not Diane's organized approach, but the specific swing of headlights belonging to a vehicle that had come through the main gate at a speed the security team had not stopped. 2 vehicles, dark-colored, the kind of vehicles that had antennae. Nolan looked at the drives in her hands. She looked at the vehicles. East Garden Wall, he said. There's a door in the south corner behind the boxwoods. It opens to the service alley. The alley connects to Birch Street in 4 minutes on foot. His voice was controlled, but she could hear what was underneath it now. Not fear for himself. Fear for what was in her hands. 4 years walking out the door. Don't stop. Don't call from the estate network. Use the number in my contacts listed under Reeves. That's my lawyer's personal cell, not the office line. She picked up both drives. She looked at him. His face in the light from the desk lamp. The silver at the temples. The hands that had gone into a burning car and come back wrong. The eyes that had stopped an engagement with 2 words and knocked before entering and said, "You deserve to hear it, and you already matter." "I'm coming back," she said. He didn't say she didn't have to say that. He didn't say anything. She ran. Down the corridor, through the kitchen, out the garden door into the cold air and the dark. And behind her she heard the front door of the estate open, and voices and the sound of official language. And she didn't stop. She ran toward the south corner where the boxwoods were black shapes against the wall, and her feet were wet from the grass, and the drives were in her jacket pockets, and she found the door by feel, the iron handle cold and stiff, and she pushed through it into the service alley, and the door swung shut behind her and the sound of the estate disappeared. The alley was dark. 4 minutes to Birch Street. She ran. In her pocket, 2 hard drives and a buried signature, and the specific weight of a woman who had just chosen which side of a burning building to be on. Behind her, through the wall, she heard something she would think about for a very long time afterward. She heard it through the wall. One sound, clear and specific, carrying through the old stone and the boxwoods and the cold service alley. Air, like it had been designed to follow her. Nolan's voice. Not raised, not panicked, saying his own name to someone who had come to take it from him, steady and deliberate the way a man speaks when he is handing something over that he expects to get back. She ran. The alley was unlit and narrow, and she went by feel and momentum, her left shoulder catching the brick wall once, and her feet finding every uneven seam in the pavement. And she counted her steps the way she'd learned to count things when the world went sideways. Something to put between herself and the volume of what was happening. 30 steps, 60. The alley curved left, and the brick smell gave way to exhaust and wet concrete, and she could see the ambient orange glow of Birch Street ahead. She didn't slow down until she hit the sidewalk. Then she stopped, pressed her back against the building at the alley mouth. Breathed, checked both directions on the street, foot traffic, two people walking a dog going north, a rideshare pulling away from a building across the street, nothing that looked organized. She checked her pockets, both drives. Phone, the thumb drive from Elias. She checked the phone. No signal lock, no obvious tracking request in the notification tray. But she'd been using the estate Wi-Fi, and if anyone had been monitoring the network, they could have installed something, and she couldn't verify that standing in an alley. She turned on airplane mode. For a moment, the phone was useless, and she was alone on Birch Street with two hard drives and no ability to call anyone. She turned the phone back on. The risk of monitored signal was smaller than the risk of not being able to reach Reeves. She found the number, called. It rang twice. Then a voice. A man. Awake despite the hour. The particular wakefulness of someone who slept lightly by professional necessity. This is Reeves. My name is Mara Whitmore. Nolan Campbell gave me this number. They came to the estate 30 minutes ago, possibly federal, and I have the primary documentation. Originals, not copies. I need to know where to go. A silence of about 4 seconds. Are you being followed? She looked back down the alley. Not yet. Where are you? Birch Street, South End. There's a parking structure 2 blocks north, level 3. I'll be there in 22 minutes. His voice was precise, no excess. A man who had taken calls like this before, possibly not exactly like this, but close enough to have a protocol. Don't go back to the estate. Don't call anyone you've spoken to in the past 48 hours on a regular basis. And don't, he paused. Are the drives encrypted? One of them. The other I don't know. Get to the structure, 22 minutes. He hung up. She walked north on Birch Street with her hands in her jacket pockets, and the drives warm from her body heat, walking the way she'd learned to walk in bad situations. Purposeful, not fast, not slow. The pace of a person who knows where they're going, rather than the pace of a person who is fleeing something. It was a difference you could read from 50 feet. She'd learned that at Stanford from a professor who'd taught a seminar on urban safety that her father had thought was beneath her. She thought about that professor and about all the things that had turned out to be useful that her father had thought were beneath her. The list was getting long. The parking structure was concrete and fluorescent and smelled like exhaust and standing water. She took the stairwell to level 3 and stood near the stairwell door where she had sightlines in 2 directions and waited. 18 minutes, 20, 22. A silver car she didn't recognize rolled onto the level. She stayed near the stairwell until the driver got out, and she recognized the field jacket and the posture and the 2 direct eyes. Elias. She walked toward him fast. Reeves sent you. Reeves called me 3 minutes after you did. He can't get here for another 40 minutes. There's a county line issue with his plates, and he needs to come a specific route. Elias looked at her jacket pockets, at the shape of the drives. He said you'd have originals. You talked to Reeves before. You know him. I've been trying to get documentation into the right hands for 2 years. Reeves knows that. He held her gaze. I'm not your father's instrument, Mara. I made a mistake going to the estate the way I did. I'm here now. Let me help you finish this. She looked at him. The field jacket, the eyes. 12 years of knowing who he was when he was working on something that mattered. My contact at the FBI field office, she said. I need to reach her before the task force handler processes Diane's statement. What's her name? Agent Carolyn Voss, Senior Field Agent, Environmental Enforcement Division. She won't be in until 6. It's 4:47. Then we need her personal cell. Elias pulled his own phone out. I might have a back channel. He was already dialing, turning away slightly, and she watched him talk to someone for 90 seconds. Short, clipped, a conversation between people who had learned to communicate in half sentences. He hung up and looked at her. I can have a number in 10 minutes. Someone I trust at the ACLU who's worked with Voss on environmental enforcement cases. 10 minutes. Less, maybe. What do you know about the handler inside the task force? Name? I don't have it, he thought. I have a contact inside the task force oversight office. Not a friend, more of a source. If the handler is moving Diane's statement through the supervisory chain tonight, there'll be a filing timestamp. If we can establish that our documentation was received by the field office before that timestamp, then our version of the record precedes theirs. Evidentiary sequencing, yes. She looked at the concrete ceiling, thought about how many things had to move in the right direction in the next 90 minutes. Then she stopped thinking about the whole of it and thought about the next 10 minutes only. Call your ACLU contact, she said. He called. While he called, she opened the laptop. She'd carried it under her arm the whole way, she'd forgotten she was carrying it, and pulled up the port manifests on Elias's drive and cross-referenced them against the authenticated financial chain on Nolan's primary documentation drive. The two datasets connected at 4 points. 4 overlap nodes where money and physical location and named individuals all appeared simultaneously. Grant Atkins at 3 of the 4 nodes, Diane Rourke at 2 of them. Richard Whitmore's company appearing as a regulatory certifier at the 4th. She added her father's compliance document photograph to the sequence and dated it. The chain was complete. Elias held out his phone with a number on the screen. She called it. It rang 6 times. She was preparing for voicemail when someone picked up, the particular sound of a person who had been asleep 2 seconds ago. Voss? The voice was rough with sleep but snapped alert almost immediately. A person who'd answered calls at bad hours before. Agent Voss, my name is Mara Whitmore. You and I met in 2021 at the Columbia Basin Water Rights hearing in Olympia. You handed me your card and said if I ever had documentation of corporate interference in federal environmental oversight, to call you. A pause. The sound of someone sitting up. I remember you. You worked for... Your father is Richard Whitmore. Yes, that's part of why I'm calling. She breathed. I have documentation of a weapons trafficking conspiracy connected to Campbell Defense. Stolen prototypes, falsified federal certifications, an operative inside the Seattle Federal Task Force who is currently moving a fabricated witness statement through the supervisory chain. The man being framed is Nolan Campbell. The actual conspirators are Grant Atkins and my father Richard Whitmore, and a woman named Diane Rourke, who was an operative embedded in the Campbell household for 15 years. Silence. Where are you right now? Voss said. Parking structure on Birch Street. Stay there. I'm 40 minutes out. Her voice had shifted. Not the rough with sleep voice, and not the polished official voice either, but a third register that was both at once. The voice of a woman who understood that 40 minutes might be close, but was going to be the number regardless. Don't send anything digitally. Don't email. Don't upload. Physical transfer only. Do you understand? Yes. Is what you have authenticated? Originals. 4 years of documentation by Nolan Campbell and his legal team, time-stamped and notarized, plus independent corroboration from an investigative journalist with 2 years of parallel research. She looked at Elias. And a photograph of a compliance document bearing my signature and my father's subsidiary listing that places Whitmore Group as a protective certifier for the cover-up structure. Another silence. Different quality. You're providing evidence against your own father. Yes? Voss didn't say anything for a moment. When she spoke again, there was something in her voice, not softness exactly, recognition. 40 minutes. Don't move. She hung up. Mara set the phone down on the trunk of Elias's car and pressed both palms flat against the metal and breathed through her nose for a count of 5. The metal was cold. That was good. Cold was concrete and concrete was real, and real was what she needed to stay inside of right now. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered. You left without the notebook. Preston's voice. Controlled and not controlled at the same time. She could hear the seam between them. She said nothing. Evelyn Campbell's notebook, he said. The one that's been in the estate this whole time. The physical evidence that ties the whole chain together. The notebook where Evelyn wrote down what she found and who she told and what she was planning to do with it before they killed her. His voice was very careful, very even. You have documentation. You don't have the notebook. And the notebook is the piece that puts my father's hands on the bomb, not just on the transfer chain, on the actual mechanism of Evelyn's death. She kept her face still, kept her voice neutral. Why are you telling me this? Because I need something. Preston, I need immunity. She almost laughed. Almost. I'm not a federal agent. No. But in 40 minutes, you're going to be sitting across from one. And the statement you give in the next several hours is going to shape every charge, every deal, every agreement that comes out of this. I know what you have. I know what you don't have. The notebook gives you everything. My cooperation gives you the notebook. His voice dipped. My father is going to burn for this. I've known that for 2 years. I've been trying to figure out which side of the fire to be on. You've been protecting him. I've been surviving. The veneer cracked slightly on the last word. Just slightly, enough to hear what was under it. Not everybody gets to be brave, Mara. Some of us just try to get to the next morning. She looked at Elias, who was close enough to hear both sides and was watching her with the particular focus of a person watching a negotiation. They understand is real. Where's the notebook? She said. In the estate. Evelyn's study. The room that's been locked for 5 years. Third shelf from the bottom, behind a false back in the built-in bookcase. I found it 2 years ago when my father sent me to retrieve something else he'd asked Diane to store there. He paused. I photographed every page. The photographs are on a server that releases to 3 journalists simultaneously if I don't enter a specific code every 48 hours. She thought about this. If your father's people take you out, the file drops, she said. It's the only insurance policy I've been able to afford. And if you give me the photographs directly, then I need to know I'm not standing at the wrong end of this when the filing happens. She looked at the concrete ceiling again, the fluorescent lights, the drives in her pocket. She thought about the bruise. She thought about this kind of person Preston was and the kind of person he would go on being regardless of this conversation. She thought about 2 years and a bracelet and the specific architecture of a life built around a man who ran calculations instead of feeling things. She thought about what Voss would want. I can't promise you immunity, she said. I can tell the agent exactly what you told me and exactly what you provided and exactly what you didn't do. That's all I can give you. Silence. The photographs release in 32 hours if I don't enter the code, he said. I'll send them to your phone now. What happens after that is yours. The call ended. 40 seconds later, her phone received a file transfer. She opened it. 114 photographs of handwritten pages. Evelyn Campbell's handwriting. She knew it from nothing, and still knew it, somehow, from the way Nolan had described her without describing her, from the energy of a woman who had found something that mattered and had written it down in the specific way of a person who understood it might be the last true record. Names, dates, facility locations, the weight and model designation of the stolen prototypes. A meeting she had attended under false pretenses, presenting herself as a Campbell Defense Board observer, where she had heard Grant Atkins and 2 other men discuss the logistics of the transfer chain. The name of the contact at the port of Tacoma, Diane Rourke, written in ink, with a date, with a notation in the margin that said, I told Nolan she can't be trusted. He doesn't see it yet. He trusts too completely. That's the thing about loving him. You have to love the parts that make him vulnerable, too. She read that sentence twice. She closed the file. She put the phone in her pocket and stood in the parking structure for a moment with the notebook photographs on her phone and the drives in her jacket and 36 minutes until Voss arrived, and the particular stillness of a person who has just touched the center of something enormous. Then her phone rang again. Nolan's number. She picked up before the second ring. You're out, she said. For now. His voice was tight. Not from the arrest. She could hear the difference between the tight of aftermath and the tight of something current. They released me on my lawyer's intervention. Temporary. They'll refile in the morning with the full statement. Reeves is working on a preemptive filing, but we need... I have Voss. She's 40 minutes out. I have the documentation, the port manifest, the compliance document, and Preston just sent me Evelyn's notebook. A silence. The notebook, he said. Every page, photographed, including her notes on Diane. She paused. including what she wrote about you. A longer silence. What did she write? He said. She looked at the concrete floor, at the fluorescent light, at the shape of the next 30 seconds of this conversation. That you trusted too completely, she said, and that it was one of the things she loved. She heard him breathe, one breath, two. The sound of a man in a car somewhere in Seattle with no gate around him, out in the open for the first time in 5 years, breathing. Get to Voss, he said. I'm getting there. Mara. She waited. Be careful with those drives, he said. But his voice had changed, not the documentation voice, not the controlled in front of 300 people voice. I will, she said. She hung up. She turned to Elias. I need you to drive. Where? We're going back to the estate. She was already moving toward the passenger side. Before Voss arrives. Before the morning filing. There's a room in the East Wing that hasn't been opened in 5 years, and the physical notebook is still inside it, and I need the original. Elias stared at her. You said not to go back. I know what I said. There are federal agents. There were 2 vehicles when I left. They arrested Nolan and then released him. The estate is either empty now or has a skeleton presence. She pulled open the passenger door. The room is 30 seconds from the East Garden entrance. 2 minutes total inside. I need the physical notebook because photographs are corroboration and originals are evidence, and I am not going to let a woman who spent her last weeks alive writing down the truth have that truth presented as secondary documentation. Elias looked at her for a long moment. Then he got in the car. They drove. The estate's main gate had a single vehicle parked outside. Not federal, it turned out, but a news van from a local affiliate that had clearly been tipped off about the arrest. A camera was set up on a tripod facing the gate. The operator was sitting on the van's bumper with a coffee, killing time. Elias drove past without slowing. The service road on the east side was empty. The door in the garden wall was still open from when she'd come through 45 minutes ago. She went in alone. Elias waited in the car with the engine running. The garden was dark and wet and silent. The main house had lights in 2 windows. Someone present, probably security, possibly one of the federal agents. She moved along the wall in the shadow of the boxwoods, the way she'd mapped the garden's sightlines in her first 3 days, the knowledge she'd collected reflexively and hadn't understood the use of until now. The East Garden entrance was unlocked. She went in. The corridor was dark. She moved by memory. The East Wing, she knew, had walked it 50 times in different states of mind. Third door from the end, the one that had always been closed, the one she'd stood outside at 3 a.m. listening to a man's difficult breathing on the other side. The door was unlocked. She stopped. She hadn't expected it to be unlocked. She pushed it open. The study was the room of a person who had been alive. That was what hit her first. Not preserved like a museum, not emptied like a space that had been grieved and cleared, but alive in the suspended way of a room that had been walked out of mid-thought and never returned to. A coffee mug on the desk with a dried ring inside it, a cardigan over the chair, papers in mid-sort on the reading table, a laptop closed but not put away, sitting at the angle of a person who had pushed it aside to look at something else. The bookshelves ran floor to ceiling on the south wall. 3rd shelf from the bottom. She crossed the room in 8 steps, ran her fingers along the shelf edge until she felt the seam in the built-in backing. A thin vertical line, not visible but tactile, about 6 inches from the left side. She pressed. The false back gave inward with a sound like a held breath releasing. Behind it, a small space. Dark. She used her phone light. A notebook. Dark green cover, no label, thick with pages. She pulled it out and held it in both hands for a moment. The weight of it, the physical specific weight of what Evelyn Campbell had written in her last weeks. She put it in her jacket. She turned to leave. The light came on. Not the overhead, a standing lamp in the corner. Someone had been in the room already, sitting in the dark, waiting. Richard Whitmore stood up from the chair behind the door. He looked not like himself. That was the first thing. Her father always looked like himself, always occupied his own surface with the ease of a man who had designed his own appearance down to the last detail. Tonight he looked like a man whose design had come apart. His jacket was wrinkled. His face had lost the careful arrangement. He looked old in a way he'd never allowed himself to look before. And something about that was almost worse than the familiar version of him. Mara, her name from his mouth, quiet, almost gentle. She didn't move from where she was standing. "How did you get in here?" she said. "The security team knows me." His voice was the reasonable voice, the calm voice, the voice she'd grown up believing was the sound of a man who had everything in hand. "They've known me for 20 years. A call is all it takes. You're in a house whose owner just got arrested on fabricated charges you helped engineer. I didn't—" He stopped. Reset. The way he always reset when a direct approach wasn't working. "I didn't engineer anything tonight. Diane made a decision I wasn't informed about. The statement she gave was not, 'You buried my signature in a compliance document that covered up an illegal weapons transfer.'" He looked at her. "You have the review," he said. "I photographed the cover sheet the day you asked me to sign it. I couldn't tell you why at the time. I can tell you now." She held his gaze. "I was your contract clause, Dad. I was the seal on the Atkins deal, not your daughter. A mechanism." Something moved across his face. She had seen her father negotiate and intimidate and charm and calculate in the same room for her entire life. She had seen all the faces he chose to wear. What moved across his face now was not a chosen face. "That's not—" He stopped again. His jaw worked. "You were always— Don't," she said it softly. "Not right now. I can't hold the version of you I needed you to be and also stand in this room, so don't make me try." He was quiet. "I need you to step away from the door," she said. He didn't move. "What's in your jacket?" he said. "Step away from the door." "Mara." And now his voice had the other quality. Not the reasonable voice, not the gentle voice, but the version that lived under both of them, the version that had built a company on the understanding that everything and everyone had a use and a cost. "You don't understand the full scope of what you're about to do. The documentation you have, the chains of connection, you are in those chains. Your signature is a link in the structure regardless of what you knew or didn't know, and if you hand that documentation over without protection, you become part of a criminal enterprise in the government's eyes. I am the only person who can contextualize your involvement in a way that keeps you clear." Or, she said, "I tell the truth, the complete truth. My signature, the document I signed, why I signed it, what I was told it was, and what it actually was. And I let a federal agent who has nothing to gain from lying make a determination about what that means. That's extraordinarily naive. It might be." She didn't look away. "But it's the only thing I actually know how to do anymore." His hand moved, not toward her, toward his pocket. She saw it, and her body moved before the thought completed. She stepped left, toward the reading table, and her hand found the closed laptop on the surface, and she had it in both hands before he'd completed the motion. He had a phone. He was looking at the phone. "I'm calling the security team," he said. "They'll hold you here until—" She threw the laptop, not at him, at the standing lamp. The lamp went sideways and the room went dark, and in the 2 seconds of sensory recalibration she moved, straight to the door, her shoulder hitting the doorframe and the pain bright and immediate and not important, and she was in the corridor and running. Behind her she heard her father's voice, raw in a way she'd never heard it, saying her name like it was something he was losing rather than something he was calling. She ran, down the East Wing corridor, through the garden door, across the wet grass, through the gap in the boxwoods, and out the wall door, and Elias's car was where she'd left it, with the engine running, and she pulled the door open and got in and said, "Go." He went. 3 minutes later, her phone buzzed, a text from her father's number. She looked at it. "You were never a mechanism. That's the truth, even if nothing else I've done is." She looked at it for a long time. Then she put the phone face down on her knee and looked out the window at Seattle moving past in the pre-dawn dark, the streets wet and orange-lit and empty. And she put her hand over her jacket pocket where the notebook was, and she felt the weight of it. And she held that weight as the car moved through the city toward a parking structure where a federal agent named Carolyn Voss was pulling in from the north with 40 years of meticulous work behind her and 1 hour to hear a story that had been killing people for 5 years. Elias parked. Across the structure's 3rd level, headlights. A door opening. A woman getting out who moved like a person who had made decisions under pressure so many times it had become the default mode of motion. Mara got out of the car. She had 2 hard drives, a thumb drive, a notebook, a photograph of a compliance document, and the truth in its entirety in several different formats. She walked toward Carolyn Voss. Behind her, behind the wall of the parking structure, behind the wet Seattle streets, behind the estate's iron gate, something was happening in a courtroom that hadn't been scheduled yet, in a proceeding that hadn't been filed yet, in a case that was about to become the only story anyone in this city would talk about for the next 6 months. Voss met her in the middle of the level. "Ms. Whitmore," she said. "Agent Voss?" Mara held out her hand. Not with the drives. Her hand. "Thank you for coming." Voss looked at her. Not the polite assessment of a first meeting. The specific assessment of a woman who had spent 20 years reading people who were about to tell her something important, reading them for the specific quality of whether they would hold. Whatever she saw, she shook the hand. "Start from the beginning," Voss said. And Mara opened her mouth. And in a parking structure on the north end of Birch Street at 5:43 in the morning, with the city beginning to lighten in the east and the rain finally breaking open the way it had been threatening to all night, the story that had been buried for 5 years began. She talked for 2 hours and 14 minutes. She didn't plan the length. She just started at the place where the truth started. Not the engagement party, not the bruise, not the photographs on Preston's laptop, but further back than that, the place where she had signed a document she hadn't fully read, because she'd been taught since she was old enough to understand the concept that her father's judgment superseded her own, and that trust was the tax you paid for belonging to someone who could protect you. She talked, and Voss listened. Voss listened the way very few people listen, not waiting for the useful part, not assembling her response while the other person spoke, but actually absorbing, occasionally writing a single word in the small notebook she'd produced from her coat pocket, her pen moving with the economy of someone who'd developed shorthand for catastrophe. 3 times she asked Mara to slow down and repeat something. Twice she asked a question so precise it felt like a surgical instrument. Elias sat on the hood of his car 15 feet away and didn't interrupt once. When Mara finished, the sky over Seattle had gone from black to the specific gray-blue that was as close as the city ever got to a clean dawn. She could hear traffic starting on the streets below the structure. The ordinary sound of a city beginning a Tuesday that would be unremarkable to almost everyone in it. Voss looked at her notes. "The handler inside the task force," she said. "You don't have a name." "No, only that Atkins placed him and that he's been there 4 years. I have 3 names it could be." Voss's voice was flat, factual. She didn't look particularly surprised by the existence of a contaminated task force, which told Mara something about the kind of work Voss had been doing for 20 years. "I'll need to move through channels that don't touch any of the 3 until I know which one." She looked at the drives on the trunk of Elias's car. "The originals stay with me. I'll need you to sign a chain of custody form." "I have them. I know you have them. I'm telling you what happens next. Not unkind, precise. You sign the chain of custody, you give me your contact information, and then you go somewhere that isn't your apartment and isn't the Campbell estate for the next 6 hours while I start the intake process. By the time the task force handler tries to file Diane Rourke's statement through the supervisory chain, I need to already be 3 steps up the ladder with documentation that makes his filing look like what it is." "What do you need from me after the intake?" "A formal statement. Today, if possible. We'll do it at the field office and we'll have counsel present." Voss paused. "Your father's signature on the compliance document. The photograph is sufficient for intake, but I'll need his original signature confirmed through Whitmore Group records. That's a subpoena. It doesn't require your cooperation beyond what you've already provided." "He's in the Campbell estate," Mara said, "or he was 40 minutes ago." Voss wrote something. "We'll know where he is in about 30 minutes. She capped her pen. Then she did something Mara hadn't expected. She looked at her directly, not the assessing look from before, but something that was marginally more human than professional. "You understand that your father is going to be charged?" "Yes." "And that the cooperation you've provided tonight doesn't constitute immunity for yourself, even though your knowing involvement appears to be—" "I know," Mara said. "I'm not here for immunity. I'm here because a woman wrote down the truth in a notebook and was killed before she could use it, and the notebook has been sitting behind a false wall for 5 years." She looked at the green cover on the car trunk. I'm here because that matters regardless of what it costs me. Voss looked at her for a moment. Then she picked up the notebook and the drives with the careful hands of someone who understood she was holding other people's years. Sign the form, she said. Mara signed. The sun came up while she was signing. She didn't notice it until she'd finished and looked up, and the parking structure's east opening was filled with actual light. Not the amber orange of the city at night, but the specific pale gold of early morning in a city that was always mildly surprised by its own good weather. She stood in that light for a moment with the pen still in her hand and felt the particular exhaustion of a body that had been running on something other than sleep for so long that the absence of the emergency was its own kind of shock. Elias drove her to his apartment in Fremont. She didn't want to go anywhere that felt like belonging to anyone. Not her father's world, not Nolan's estate, not the Capitol Hill apartment that still had Preston's fingerprints in its architecture. Elias's apartment was 3 rooms and evidence of work everywhere, and a couch that was clearly used as a primary thinking surface, covered in journals and printed articles and the archaeological layering of a person who never fully stopped. She moved 3 journals and sat down and didn't say anything for a while. He made eggs. He made them without asking if she wanted them, which was the right call. She ate. Your father texted you, he said, not asking. He'd been close enough in the car to see the notification. Yes. What did he say? She looked at the eggs. That I was never a mechanism, that he wanted me to know that. Elias was quiet for a moment. Do you believe him? She thought about it. Really thought about it. Not the quick no that would have been easier and more protective, but the slow, honest examination of a person whose father had shaped the architecture of who she was before she'd had the language to choose differently. She thought about the first version of him she'd known, the man who'd taught her to read tide charts on Puget Sound when she was 6, who had sat next to her at her mother's hospital bedside for 9 days without sleeping, who had looked at her environmental policy brief once in her 20s and said it was good before immediately pivoting to why it wasn't what she should be spending time on. She thought about the compliance document, about Preston at her father's table, about 17 contracts and $400 million. I believe he loved me, she said, and I believe he made choices that treated me as a resource. I think those 2 things lived in him at the same time, and I don't think he ever fully understood the contradiction, because he's a man who built his entire life on the premise that love is expressed through provision and protection. And if you believe that hard enough, you can convince yourself that using someone for their benefit counts. Elias looked at her. That's a very precise kind of grief, he said. It's been a very precise kind of loss, she said. They didn't talk much after that. She slept on his couch for 3 hours and woke to 4 missed calls from Reeves, 1 from Nolan, and a text from a number she didn't recognize that turned out to be Voss's personal cell. Handler identified and suspended pending investigation. Statement intake complete. Field office filing time-stamped 0742. Call me when you're up. She called. Voss's voice was the voice of a woman who had been awake for the better part of 36 hours and wasn't going to stop yet. The task force handler is a senior agent named Calloway. He's been suspended with pay pending an internal affairs review. Diane Rourke's statement has been flagged and sequestered. It won't move forward in the system while the review is active. A pause. We executed search warrants on Atkins Group Holdings at 6 this morning. Grant Atkins was taken into custody at 7:40. His lawyers are already screaming, but we have the originals and the port manifests, and the notebook and the financial chain is comprehensive enough that screaming is about all they have. Mara sat up on Elias's couch. Diane Rourke. She was on a flight to Vancouver that departed at 6:15. Canadian Border Services is cooperative. She'll be in custody by this afternoon. Preston Atkins. A short pause. He came in voluntarily at 6:30 with his own counsel. He's been in an interview room since then. Another pause, briefer. The statement he's giving is extensive. And my father. The pause this time was the kind that had texture. Richard Whitmore surrendered at the Whitmore Group offices at 7:50 with his attorney present, Voss said. He made a statement before anyone asked him to. He requested specifically that it be entered into the record that the compliance document you produced was signed by you without full knowledge of its contents, and that the use of your signature was his decision and his alone. She let that sit for a moment. He's cooperating fully. Mara put her hand over her eyes. The back of her hand was cold. She pressed it against her eyelids and held it there. "Okay," she said. "The formal statement I need from you. 2 o'clock, field office, 3rd and Pike. Bring the photograph of the compliance document on your phone in case we need the original file transferred. Reeves can be present if you want Campbell's legal team in the room." "I'll be there." "Ms. Whitmore." Voss's voice changed register slightly. The 3rd register, the one that was both awake and human simultaneously. "What you brought in this morning will hold. I want you to know that. It's going to take months, possibly longer, and it's going to be ugly in the ways these things are always ugly. But it will hold." Mara lowered her hand from her eyes. The Fremont apartment was full of morning light, and the smell of the eggs Elias had made, and the particular quiet of a space that was used to having important things thought in it. "Thank you," she said. She hung up. She called Nolan. He answered on the first ring, which she suspected meant he'd been holding the phone. "It's done," she said. "Atkins is in custody. Diane will be by this afternoon. The handler has been suspended. The documentation is in." Silence. Not the silence of a man receiving good news. The silence of a man receiving the end of something very long. "Your father," he said, "surrendered voluntarily. He's cooperating. He cleared my name in his first statement." "Mara, I know." She looked at the light on Elias's wall. "It doesn't fix it, but I know." He was quiet for another moment. "Are you all right?" She thought about all the versions of not all right that she was. The exhaustion and the grief and the specific wound of having handed over evidence that would send her father to prison, and the bruise on her wrist that was almost gone now, 7 days old, the yellow-green fading toward her own skin color. The compound weight of 2 years and 5 years and 15 years settling into a form that could be carried rather than a form that crushed. "I'm okay," she said. "That's not what I asked." She almost smiled. "No, I'm not all right. I'm many specific things that are not all right, and I'll probably be most of them for a while." She paused. "But I'm here. That's what I've got right now." "Then that's enough," he said. She heard something in his voice. Not just the relief of a man whose legal situation had been transformed in the past 4 hours, but something older than that, the thing he'd been carrying since the gate, the 5 years of it. Something in it had shifted, not lifted. She understood enough about grief to know it didn't lift. It changed shape. It became something you could set down occasionally rather than something that had fused to your hands. "The statement," he said. 2 o'clock? "Yes, I'll be there." A pause. "Not because Reeves told me to." She knew what he meant. "I know," she said. The field office at 3rd and Pike was a building that looked like bureaucracy from the outside and felt, inside, like the particular compressed efficiency of a place where a lot of hard things got done without ceremony. She arrived at 1:45 in a car she'd borrowed from Elias. She was wearing the same clothes she'd been wearing for 20 hours, which she'd considered remedying and then decided against because she didn't have anything in Elias's apartment and she wasn't going to her own apartment, and she was done managing her surface for other people's benefit. Reeves was in the lobby. Nolan was beside him. He looked different, not in any dramatic way. Not the way people look in movies when something significant has happened, transformed and luminous. He looked tired and unshaven and like a man who had spent the morning in a series of rooms answering questions he'd been waiting 5 years to be asked. His suit jacket was gone. He was in a white shirt with the sleeves pushed up and his hands were at his sides. And when he looked at her across the lobby, it was with the direct, unguarded quality of a man who had spent too long managing what he let himself show and was running low on the reserve needed to maintain it. She walked across the lobby. She stopped 2 feet from him. She looked at his hands. The hands she'd thought about the first night, the hands that had gone into a burning car. They were still. Not the controlled stillness, the real kind. "You left without the drives," he said. "I had the drives." "The documentation drives. You left 2 additional—" "I know what I left." She looked at him. "They were the copies. I had the originals." He absorbed this. "You knew the difference before you ran," he said. "I knew the difference." Something crossed his face. It wasn't gratitude, and it wasn't admiration, and she couldn't find the name for it exactly, but it was the expression of a man seeing something clearly that he hadn't been able to see clearly before, something about the person standing in front of him. "Come on," said Reeves from somewhere beside them, with the voice of a lawyer who had been managing other people's significant moments for 30 years and found them professionally interesting. "We have 12 minutes. They went in. The statement took 3 hours. She told it the same way she'd told it to Voss at 5:43 in the morning. Plain, complete, with no editorializing and no softening. The compliance document, the photographs from Preston's laptop, the drives, the notebook, her father, her name. Every specific thing she'd known and when she'd known it and how. Nolan gave his statement separately in an adjacent room, and she understood later, reading the summary Reeves provided, that he had told the same story. The 4 years of documentation, the whiteboard in the library, the red dotted line labeled GA that had been drawn and redrawn as a question for so long, it had become a kind of furniture of his grief, present in every room of the investigation, whether he was looking at it or not. She didn't see Preston that day. He was in the building. Voss confirmed it in a brief exchange in the corridor between sessions, in a different room with different lawyers giving a different kind of statement, the kind where the person giving it was trying to calibrate how much to provide and how much to withhold in order to land in the least terrible available position. She didn't feel anything particular about that. She'd said what she could to Voss about his cooperation. The rest was between Preston Atkins and the consequences of the specific life he'd chosen. She thought briefly and only once about the man she'd thought he was 14 months ago. She let herself think it all the way through to its conclusion, the same way she'd thought about her father, the real version, not the easier version. Then she set it down. She was at the field office until 6:15. Walking out, the evening air hit her like a recalibration. Cold, salt-tinged, the particular weight of Seattle at the end of a day when the sky had been working all day to produce something and hadn't fully committed. Nolan came out 30 seconds after her. Reeves was already on the phone, pacing the sidewalk with the focused energy of a man with 12 more calls to make. She and Nolan stood on the 3rd and Pike sidewalk with the foot traffic of end-of-day Seattle moving around them on all sides, people going to their cars and their restaurants and their ordinary Tuesday evenings, the city making its ordinary sounds. "The estate," he said. You're welcome to return. Until everything settles. Until your apartment is... Until it makes sense." She looked at him. "Is that what you want?" He looked back at her. No deflection, no management. "Yes." She thought about the East Wing bedroom, the excellent coffee, the corridor at 3 in the morning, the window and the gate and the knock before entering, and all the small specific ways a person could show you who they were if you watched rather than listened. "Okay," she said. They rode back to the estate in Reeves's car. Reeves in the front, still on his calls. Mara and Nolan in the back, not talking. The city giving way to the neighborhoods, and the neighborhoods giving way to the long tree-lined drive. The gates were open when they arrived. Not propped, actually open. The mechanism engaged, standing wide. She noticed. He noticed her noticing. "I opened them this morning," he said. "Before everything. I wanted to see if I could." "Could you?" "I walked to the end of the drive." He looked at his hands in his lap. "Stood on the street for 2 minutes, then came back in." A pause. "Didn't fall apart." "That's not nothing," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's not nothing." The weeks that followed had a different architecture than any weeks Mara had lived before them. The investigation metastasized across the national news the way investigations do when there are multiple defendants and decades of wrongdoing and enough money involved to make every detail feel both shocking and inevitable. The federal task force was restructured with Calloway removed, and 3 other cases from his tenure flagged for review. Diane Rourke was extradited from Vancouver on a Tuesday and arrived in Seattle in handcuffs on a Thursday, and the news photographs of her arrival were the ones that made the front pages. A small, precise woman looking straight at the cameras with the expression of someone who had prepared for this particular event and found the reality of it neither better nor worse than the preparation. Preston Atkins was charged with conspiracy, obstruction, and 3 counts related to the weapons transfer chain. He entered a cooperation agreement. It wasn't immunity. It was less prison than his father's outcome and more than he'd hoped for. And he had to live with the math of that for the rest of his life, which Mara thought was a reasonably appropriate cost. Grant Atkins was charged on 14 counts. He went to trial. He contested every charge with the resources of a man who had spent 50 years believing that enough money and enough lawyers could reshape any reality. He was wrong this time. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The verdict took the jury one day. Richard Whitmore pleaded guilty. He pleaded guilty on a Monday morning in a courtroom Mara did not attend. She watched the live feed on her laptop in the estate library, sitting at the reading table where she'd first seen the corporate structure whiteboard, and she watched her father stand before a judge in a charcoal suit that had been pressed and a posture that was still, even now, carefully maintained, and say the words that meant he understood what he had done and would accept the consequence. His sentence was announced 6 weeks after the plea, 4 years, with potential reduction for cooperation. He would lose the company. He would lose the reputation. He would lose the $400 million in contracts that had been the reason for all of it. She got a letter from him 3 days after sentencing, handwritten, which surprised her. She hadn't known he still wrote by hand. He wrote about her mother, about the year her mother died when Mara was 11, and how the company had become the thing he'd built the grief into because he hadn't known what else to do with it. He wrote about the compliance document. He didn't call it a mistake. He called it a decision he'd made for reasons that had stopped being good reasons long before he'd stopped acting on them, and that distinction, he said, was the thing he'd have to spend the next several years actually understanding. At the bottom of the letter, in smaller script, "The brief is good, Mara. It's better than good. Find someone who'll publish it." She read the letter twice. She put it in the wooden box from her apartment, not in the trash, not displayed. Stored. The appropriate place for something true that was also painful, where it could be returned to without it having to be looked at every day. The brief was published 4 months later in a Pacific Northwest environmental policy journal. The editor called it the most rigorous piece of writing on Columbia Basin water rights in 15 years. A senator from Oregon requested a copy. She submitted it under her own name, Mara Whitmore. No qualifications, no father's company, no fiance's name, just hers. The Campbell estate changed with the seasons. That was the truest way she could describe it. Not that it transformed, not that grief was defeated and replaced with something uncomplicated and bright. Just that it changed. The way places change when the people inside them decide to stop being only the worst version of what they've been through. Nolan started going outside, not all at once, not heroically. The first week after the arrest, he walked to the end of the drive and back every morning, the way you relearn something your body has forgotten, with attention, with occasional failure, with the specific humility of a man who had been afraid of a driveway for 5 years and was not going to pretend that the fear had simply disappeared because the worst of what caused it had finally been named. Some mornings she watched from the library window. Some mornings she walked beside him. He never asked her to come, and she never announced she was coming, and the arrangement of it, the mutual understanding that presence was offered rather than required, was something that suited them both in a way that felt like it had been arrived at through the particular intimacy of having survived a crisis together rather than the ordinary intimacy of a beginning. Because it wasn't a beginning. It was something that didn't have a clean name, not a beginning and not exactly an already established thing, but the particular territory that exists when two people have been through enough together that they've earned the right to be honest about what they feel without the protection of pretending they don't feel it yet. She was in Evelyn's study one afternoon in October, 6 weeks after the trial. She'd asked Nolan 2 weeks earlier if she could use it as a workspace. She'd framed it as practical. The light was good, the shelves were right for the kind of materials she was working with, the desk was the right height. All of that was true. It was also true that she'd asked because she'd understood something about what leaving the room sealed had been costing him. Not the practical cost. The cost of a place that had been made into a monument to grief rather than a continuation of the life that had been lived in it. He'd said yes without a long pause. The first day she'd worked in there, she'd moved the cardigan from the chair to the bookshelf. Not away, not into storage, just to the shelf. She'd washed the coffee mug and put it back on the desk. She'd opened the curtains. She was at the desk working on a follow-up brief when he came in. He stood in the doorway for a moment, the first time she'd seen him in this room since the night everything had broken open. He looked at the open curtains, at the cardigan on the shelf, at the cleared desk where his wife had worked, at Mara sitting in it with her own papers and her own coffee mug and her own presence. Something moved through him. She watched it and didn't look away and didn't try to manage it for him. He came in. He sat in the chair across from the desk. Not the desk chair, the reading chair that had always been positioned slightly to the side. The one Mara had come to think of as the listening chair. He sat in it and looked at the room and didn't speak for a while. "I used to think that letting time pass in here meant I was moving on," he said. "That moving on meant leaving her behind." Mara looked at her papers, at the desk. "She's in the case," she said. "She's in the record. Her name is in a federal proceeding, and every person who tried to bury what she found is either in prison or facing it. That's not leaving behind." She looked at him. "That's what she was trying to do." He looked at her. "It's what you helped finish," he said. She shook her head slightly. "She started it. You kept it. I just brought it somewhere it could land." He was quiet again. The late October light coming through the open curtains was the color of the inside of a whiskey glass. Amber and specific and brief. The kind of light that Seattle produced on the 14 days a year when the clouds broke in the afternoon and the sun got low and everything looked temporarily worth it. It came through the window and fell across the desk, and across both of them, and across the cardigan on the shelf, and across the room where a woman had once written down the truth and been killed for knowing it. "The photograph," he said. "Evelyn's photograph. From the hallway." She knew the one, the silver frame that had been moved during the investigation, shifted in the upheaval of search warrants and security reviews, and had ended up on a windowsill in the main corridor, slightly off-center, slightly wrong. "I'll put it back," she said. "Where it belongs." "Where does it belong?" She thought about it. "In the main room," she said, "where people can see it. Not as the center of the room, but present. The way someone is present when they've been part of something and their part is respected." She met his eyes. "She's not something to get past. She's someone who was here." He looked at her for a long time. The kind of look that the person gives when they are looking at someone who has said the exact true thing. Not the comforting thing, not the easy thing, but the thing that is true, and that they will carry with them, because it was said by this person in this room at this specific angle of October light. "Okay," he said. She went and got the photograph that evening. She put it on the mantel in the main sitting room, adjusted the frame, stepped back. It was right. Nolan was standing in the doorway of the sitting room when she turned around. He was looking at the photograph with an expression that had no armor in it. The carved geography face, the controlled in front of 300 people face, the face she'd been watching change for 2 months. It was just his face. Present, tired, holding something enormous, and somehow still functional, still here, still the face of a man who had walked to the end of his driveway and come back. He crossed the room. He stood in front of her. He put his hand against the side of her face, his thumb at the edge of her jaw, carefully. The way a person touches something they have understood the value of through the experience of having almost lost the chance. She put her hand over his. He kissed her. Not the way a story ends with a kiss. The way a person kisses when they have been afraid for a very long time and the fear has finally become less loud than everything else. Slowly, and with a kind of attention that was its own language. Not a language that needed translating, not a language that required a particular history or a particular kind of person to understand. Just the language of two people who had spent enough time being honest with each other that there was nothing left to perform. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers for a moment. She felt him breathe. "The gates are open," she said softly. Not asking, just saying the true thing. "They're open," he said. Outside, the amber light on the Campbell estate did what light does in October in Seattle when it has burned itself out completely. It faded clean and fast, the sky going from whiskey to slate to the particular blue dark that was neither day nor night. The city lights beginning to appear in the distance beyond the open gates. The sound of wind in the grounds crew's remaining work. Everything settling. She put her arm around him. He let her. They stood in the main sitting room with Evelyn's photograph on the mantel and the October dark coming in through the open curtains, and all of it, the bruise and the photograph and the notebook and the document and the drives and the courtroom and the driveway and the corridor at 3 a.m. and everything else, all of it, settled into the specific quiet of things that have finally been survived, not erased, not fixed, not even healed exactly, in the clean way that word implies, but survived. And in the corner of the room, unnoticed and unremarkable, the estate's small television was on with the volume down, and across its screen scrolled the final wire report from the day's proceedings. The sentence for Grant Atkins, life without parole, and the case number attached to everything they had built and carried and handed over and fought for scrolled past in small type underneath the headline. The estate changed with the seasons. The gates remained open, and the woman who had once stood in a ballroom with a bruise under a bracelet sat beside a man who had once stood in front of his own driveway in terror, and neither of them spoke for a while, and neither of them needed to. Outside, Seattle went about its evening, and inside the room, something quiet and real and earned continued.